Hi, everybody. Welcome to the workshop. We will get started here shortly. Thanks for your patience.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's Climate Equity Implementation Workshop, hosted by the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact. My name is Karina Castillo, and I am a Resilience Coordinator for Community Engagement and Outreach with the Miami-Dade County Office of Resilience. But I also support the work prioritized by the Compact's Climate Leadership Committee. We're very glad that you're able to join us today. And today's workshop is focused on increasing understanding of how climate change functions as a threat multiplier and how it is particularly burdensome and disproportionately borne by frontline communities, which include people of color, individuals with low wealth or limited income, the elderly, the unhoused, people with disabilities, youth, incarcerated individuals, and others. Individuals with multiple vulnerability factors, such as being a person of color, a non-English speaker, or low income, experience cascading climate impacts more acutely. This workshop was originally planned as an in-person implementation workshop in March of 2020, but had to be postponed due to the emergence of the pandemic. And what a year it's been. Here we are. To create equitable climate solutions and advance social equity, local governments have to understand how existing policies and processes are explicitly and implicitly biased to certain populations. By understanding the implications of climate threats and solutions for all members of our community, and encouraging authentic dialogue with groups most vulnerable, local governments can really create effective policies and practices that equally distribute benefits and burdens, build resilience and trust, and promote additional community-wide co-benefits. I would like to take a moment to recognize that we cannot be hosting today's implementation workshop without the help of the Planning Committee. The Planning Committee included Olivia Collins from the Clio Institute, Myra Cruz from Catalyst Miami, and staff from the Compact Counties. Thank you. I also want to thank the more extensive Planning Committee that initially helped to develop the agenda when the workshop was to be in person. This included Zalala Medefres from Catalyst Miami, Yoka Arditi Rocha from the Clio Institute, Suzanne Bundy from Broward County, and Ike Powell from Palm Beach County, in addition to Compact staff. You'll be hearing from some of these wonderful individuals today. This group was really instrumental in sharing the structure, format, and speakers for the workshop. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Next slide, please. In 2009, government leaders from Broward, Miami-Dade, Monroe, and Palm Beach counties came together to form the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact. The compact represents a groundbreaking regional effort to align local government action to build resilience to climate change and reduce greenhouse gas emissions across the 4-county region of Southeast Florida. For more than 10 years, the compact counties have successfully collaborated on mitigation and adaptation strategies, built bipartisan support for action, and forged partnerships with key stakeholders, including economic development entities, community-based organizations, the academic community, enabling the development of a regional voice and vision for future prosperity of all in our Southeast Florida region. Next slide, please. Recognizing the importance of integrating social equity into climate resilience work, a social equity chapter with 7 key equity recommendations was included in the 2017 RCAP 2.0, the Regional Climate Action Plan. These recommendations were developed through a series of roundtable events with important community leaders, some of whom are on this call today, or on this webinar today, who helped ground truth the recommendations and provided expert guidance. Today, we thank all those who played a vital role in developing those recommendations and look forward to their continued refinement into the future. And in fact, today's workshop is meant to support implementation of some of those social equity recommendations. Back in the summer of 2019, the Compact Leadership Committee agreed to create an equity knowledge exchange group to flesh out how to further incorporate equity into climate action and how that can be accomplished as a region as diverse as ours, a region with almost 6 million people. Initial conversations revealed a need for building additional understanding and capacity on this topic. So with the support of the Institute for Sustainable Communities, a multi-session equity training was offered to staff from the compact counties over the summer of 2021. Following that, the Equity Knowledge Exchange Group quickly pivoted to planning and working with community members to plan the original in-person workshop. And our work is not done. The Equity Knowledge Exchange will continue working on developing a proposal on how the compact can continue to build regional capacity on this issue. Most importantly, we recognize that climate resilience cannot be done without building other forms of resilience and addressing many of the other topics that are so important to making sure that we have an equitable community across equitable communities across the region. Next slide, please. So before today's workshop, in advance of it, you received an email with some resources that you'll hear about today. So I will go over them for you. You should have received a glossary of equity terms. Consider this your cheat sheet for today. This document helps to ground your participation in shared language and lexicon that may be used throughout the discussions and presentations. So keep it close by. You also should have received a link to the RCAP social equity recommendations that are also on the website. And you also received resources for implementing those social equity recommendations. That's been, it's a list of externally vetted guides, toolkits, model policy, and other resources from other organizations that are leaders in climate equity to support those RCAP recommendations. You also should have received what we're calling the equity guidance for the Compact Climate Assessment Tool. That tool is being released later this year. And this was developed by a group of local equity experts in our own backyard. And these resources provide concrete, tangible guidance on how equity can be embedded into 11 key mitigation and adaptation actions that many local governments are already advancing. And finally, but not least, you should have received the climate equity poster. This poster outlines vulnerabilities to climate change in the region from an equity lens and was on display at our last in-person Compact Leadership Summit in Key West. So we hope that you take advantage of all these resources. Next slide, please. So why are we here today? Today's webinar will help us understand what impacts are happening in our own communities, how they are affecting our people, which are our most valuable asset, what vulnerabilities and challenges they are facing, how local governments can use socioeconomic and climate data together to advance equitable climate resilience policies, and then also learn about best practices from community engagement from on-the-ground leaders and local governments. Next slide, please. The original in-person workshop was planned as a full-day event, and the agenda covered more topics than we are able to include in today's half-day workshop. We recognize that this agenda just begins to scratch the surface of our shared learnings on equity, and we encourage participants to continue to seek out additional resources and learning opportunities following today's event. But we know that you're in for a real treat this afternoon. Many of our counties have already established equity and inclusion offices, and it's pivotal that you reach out and learn about their work and see how we can connect with them as well. So for today, we'll start the day by hearing about on-the-ground experiences from panelists who work in our community and help us get on the same page in understanding how policy has historically impacted equity and how it continues to shape outcomes today. Then we'll hear from panelists that highlight real-world examples of best practices to integrate equity into climate policy and projects, and understand how local governments have embedded a climate equity institutional plans and goals. So that will be a great highlight. We'll then have a short break so you can rest up and take a break. And then we'll come back for a second session on exploring and learning best practices from community-driven planning processes that empower those most impacted. And then also hear how we can co-design and shape the decisions that impact our lives. And so before I introduce our fabulous first panel, a few housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the Compact's website after the session. All attendees are muted. If you have technical difficulties, please use the Q&A box and someone will reach out to help you resolve the issue. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask a question at any point during the speaker's presentations. After each session, we will have time for Q&A and we will get to as many as possible, but given the number of attendees, we unfortunately won't get to all of them. In a second, in the chat box, you'll see a link to the agenda and our speakers' full bios and emails are there for your reference. Next slide, please. So without further ado, let's get started. For our first session, we will start off by hearing a recorded message from Nadej Green from the Community Justice Project. She had a scheduling conflict, can't join us live, but was gracious enough to record her message just yesterday. We'll then hear from our esteemed panelist, Caroline Lewis, the founder of the Clio Institute, the Honorable Commissioner Nancy Mateer from Coral Springs in a conversation, and they'll both be in a conversation moderated by Zalala Medefris from Catalyst Miami. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to Clio and Catalyst for helping us plan today's event and for your continued efforts to help those most in need across our region. So, Nadej, let's hear from you.
For having me. Thank you all so much for having me today. I'm Nadej Green, and I just wanted to orient us a little bit around history in the South Florida region to better understand what we're talking about when we talk about climate equity and climate justice, specifically, in low income, working class.
So sorry, one second as we resolve those, that little technical issue. Thank you for your patience, everyone. All right. Okay. Are we
for having me. Thank you all so much for having me today. I'm Nadej Green, and I just wanted to orient us a little bit around history in the South Florida region to better understand what we're talking about when we talk about climate equity and climate justice, specifically, in low income working class communities for Black and Brown folks in South Florida. And so for me, a good grounding or starting place is obviously the very foundation of South Florida, the incorporation of our multiple counties. And we can't talk about, South Florida really existing without talking about Black people, because Black folks built the very foundation and infrastructure of South Florida, from the Keys to Palm Beach County. If not for Bahamian migrants who came here, and Black Americans who migrated south from the Carolinas and other places, the very infrastructure of this space would not be. That South Florida was quite literally built with Black labor. And so I want to name that Black folks are pioneers of South Florida in a way that's not spoken. And I think it's important to talk about that, especially around equity and climate justice, because from the very beginning of the founding of this space, climate, environmental concerns have always been a thing, right? That this has always been a part of this place. And we have to understand the traditions. We have to understand the policies and things that occurred long before 2021 to understand the foundations of what we're seeing today. And so we have to, for me, talk about the Great Hurricane of 1926, which struck Miami on September 16th. Winds were as strong as 140 miles per hour. Storm surges battered the waterfront. And back then, and still today, the waterfront was predominantly white, or all white, really, in the 1920s because of segregation. Black folks did not live on that side. Black people in Miami and Black people throughout South Florida were often relegated to one part of town. In Miami-Dade in particular, it was called Colored Town, now modern day Overtown. And I talk about the Great Hurricane of 1926 within the context of climate equity and climate justice, because Black folks were inland, right? And so while they were impacted by the hurricane, mostly property damage from the winds, and because the homes were typically wooden frame homes, their homes were damaged, but the brunt of that hurricane was felt in all white communities by the waterfront. And we're talking about an era where Black land and Black people were not considered as valuable or valued as white land and white people. And so the city of Miami and Miami-Dade County, after surveying the catastrophe in the predominantly white or all white areas of Miami, decided to order a Negro conscription, which essentially meant that all Black males of workable age were ordered to clear the debris in the whites-only waterfront communities. They sent in the National Guard into Miami's Colored Town community to gather Black males against their will to clean up the all-white waterfront. And we just have to pause in that moment, because still today we see that continuation of what Black labor looks like when it comes to disaster relief, right? It may not be a conscription in modern times, certainly, but if you look at what happens, for example, when a hurricane is coming, specifically within the context of hurricanes in South Florida, who is the labor force, right? That is cleaning up the properties, prepping the properties ahead of time. It is typically Black and brown folks who are making sure the hotels are together. They're making sure the value tourist areas are, boarded up. But the question goes, but what about their homes? What about where they are? Are they okay? And in the same way that we saw in the 1920s, where Black labor was ordered to make sure the tourist areas and predominantly white areas were going to be ready and cleaned up, I think we still have to query, what does justice look like in 2021? And things that we have seen in the South Florida region, where Black and brown folks, domestic workers, workers in the service industry are typically working up to the storm. And so what does preparation look like in a space that is very tourism heavy, And where do we put the value for those workers, right? Is it on the institutions that they work for, or do we care about how they are able to be safe in their own homes? And disproportionately, that answer is we aren't caring about what it means to make sure that our low-wage workers who work in the service industry, who are working up to the day before a storm, are okay. And so what are the implications of that for those families who weren't able to board up their homes or who weren't able to go out and get all the things and prep that they needed, right? And again, underscoring the fact that these are low-wage workers, in a lot of cases, are unable to afford. You know, we know that when a hurricane is approaching, that we are told that you need at least 2 to 3 weeks worth of supply, right? That 3 days worth of supply minimum. But most people shop for at least 2 weeks. But even those 3 days worth of supplies, so many people are unable to do that or to carry that cost. Yet they are laboring in other spaces to make sure that those spaces are okay. So that's just one example of the inequities, even just around labor, Black labor and disaster relief, right? Low-income labor and disaster relief. Or in the case of the 1926 conscription, it was not even low-income labor. This was forced labor. And to really think through that, I think, is important as we see what we call disaster resiliency looks like, right? I also think it's important for us, you know, right now, one of the big conversations happening, and I'm kind of just doing some big umbrella themes that I know we're thinking about and talking about in South Florida. One of those big umbrella themes has been around elevation, right? And the idea of, or the theory of climate change gentrification. Because I really want to orient us not in necessarily the physical damage, like what happens when a storm hits to the space, but also what happens before and after, and what are the things that lead up to the inequities that we see. So when we talk about climate change gentrification, for example, you know, again, the theory is that gentrification is being sped up in communities that sit on higher elevation as more people consider the impact of sea level rise and flooding. Now, regardless of what you call it, because you will have folks who say, well, I don't use climate gentrification, or I don't like the term climate gentrification. In planning and zoning world, you normally hear climate gentrification more used in advocacy spaces and academic spaces. In the planning and zoning world, they call it smart planning. And they use terms like flood resilient or flood tolerant neighborhoods. But we're talking about the same thing, right? Whether you're saying it's flood resilient, flood tolerant, or it's climate gentrification, the defining line here is that people care about elevation. They care about flooding. And as a result of that, folks are looking to areas that sit on higher elevation in a way that they were not looking before. This does not mean that people are not building along the waterfront still. Absolutely, they are. But what it does mean is now that there is a shift in not just looking at the waterfront, but actually seeing the value of inland land. And again, we cannot divorce inland communities from the history of segregation and racism in South Florida. Because if you look at Henry Flagler's Railroad, which is a clear dividing line around race across the counties, right? The railroad was built on higher elevation so that the railway would not flood, right? It's built along a coral ridge. East of that coral ridge historically has been all white communities. Just west of that coral ridge have been historically all Black communities that sit on higher elevation. And so you have to understand the history of redlining to talk about what we're talking about with elevation right now. And so climate justice and climate equity, as we see it and as we're talking about it, again, is not just what happens when a storm hits, but we're talking about displacement. We're talking about access to safe and affordable housing, because in higher elevation communities, one of the things anecdotally we're starting to see, and also work that's starting to be documented in scholarship, is that the home values are going up. These tend to be neighborhoods where housing, rentals, tend to be what we call naturally occurring affordable housing, which is this is not housing that's government subsidized, that it's just naturally cheap. And by naturally cheap, we mean it's likely in a disinvested community. And so rent is slightly lower than market rate, right? Not significantly so, but enough so that it's more affordable than market rate apartments. But as people eye these higher elevation communities, we now have to think through, okay, like now what does access to affordable housing look like in communities that were built by Black folks, that where Black folks resided for decades, but all of a sudden now you cannot live in your neighborhood because rent prices are going up. And on the buyer side, people are looking at it like this is a smart investment, right? If you are a cautious buyer, if you are a buyer who cares about flood costs, as we care more about insurance rates, like all of these are things that impact conversations around climate justice. Like, where do people go? And if you are going into higher elevation communities, the folks who are displaced from those higher elevation communities as a result of the rising costs, where do they go? And who is following that? And how do you track that, right? That is an incredibly important conversation to have across our counties as we consider what smart planning looks like. Or flood resilience look like? Will the housing that's built now in flood resilient neighborhoods, because there definitely is a will and a want to build more densely in higher elevation neighborhoods, that this is something that has been said in planning and zoning meetings in local municipalities. But what gets built there and for whom? And so when we talk about climate justice, when we talk about equity in South Florida, certainly around elevation and sea level rise, we have to talk about displacement and affordable housing, that all of those things go together. And again, that is a year-round conversation. That's not a conversation that happens when we get a tropical storm warning, right? That this is something that is a constant, and keeping track of that. And I also have to name that even as we're talking about, sea level rise, homeowners in South Florida who live on property that have septic tanks are highly at risk, right, from groundwater rising. So for those homeowners who are low income or who are on fixed income as seniors, the idea or the cost of connecting a septic tank to the sewer line is not attainable for them, right? It is incredibly expensive. And again, when we think about the role that policy plays here, in Miami-Dade, for example, I believe this was in the 1980s, there was actually, the commission was actually considering making all new buildings required to hook up to the sewer so that there would be no more septic tanks. And local realtor and lobbyists with land ownership fought against that and won. So there was a time where there was a policy proposed that would have maybe buffered what we're seeing now, absolutely buffered what we're seeing now, because new homes would have been required to have been connected to sewer lines and not septic, right? But that policy was fought by lobbyists and won. And so again, like querying like the historical record, querying historical policies, and also how do we take that information and say, okay, like you can see the mistakes that were made, we can see the errors that were made. How do we now build on that so that new policies do not recreate these systemic inequities that are tradition in South Florida? Because it's important to name and to say that, right? That this is a tradition. Inequity here is not something that happened last week. It's not something that happened last year. But as we grounded ourselves in the beginning in 1926, I mean, from the very founding of our counties here in South Florida, from the Keys to Palm Beach County, we have seen that this is something that is built upon, right? That these inequities have existed throughout, that this is a through line, it's consistent, and it is a tradition, but it does not mean that it can't be dismantled now or that we can't work towards dismantling it. But certainly we have to know that this is not new, right? And that this is something that is inherent to the very founding of these spaces, is climate inequity and climate injustices, specifically for the most vulnerable and the people who are put in the margins of our communities. And last, one of the, umbrella big topics I know that we are all thinking about and talking about is heat. We know that it is getting hotter. And in the state of Florida, interestingly enough, public housing is required to have heat, but not central AC. So it's a federal requirement that public housing have heat in Florida. We don't need that, but it's not a requirement to have central AC. So if you live in public housing, and if we query like who lives in public housing, it is largely single moms with children, individuals with disabilities, and the elderly. And so we have some of our most vulnerable populations in public housing who are moderate to low income, but do not have access to central air conditioning in a place that is only getting hotter. So when you drive around our neighborhoods, especially neighborhoods that do not have central AC, public housing, low income housing, and even some housing where there's AC, but people just don't turn it on because it's too expensive. They cannot afford that summer AC bill. What you see is creative workarounds around the heat. And so you'll see in places in Lauderhill and Broward County where folks will congregate on a sidewalk underneath a single tree, and they'll take their plastic chairs and sit around it. You see that in Belle Glades. You see that in Overtown and Liberty City, in parts of South Miami-Dade County, right? So that you see people are seeking out shade. In my end of the county, in North Dade County, one of the things I see every summer is I see elderly women sitting at Publix on the benches next to where the scale is, where people weigh themselves, right? That the entryway in Publix has become a cooling center for them. Yet there are no designated cooling centers in these communities, right, as it gets hotter. And so as a result of that, you see creative workarounds to the heat. And interestingly enough, going back to redlining, because redlining and housing segregation impacts pretty much everything, right? There is a direct correlation, and we've seen this in some studies that have recently come out with redlining and shade canopy. And so if you are in a formerly redlined neighborhoods that without any rhyme or reason were declared hazardous because Black folks lived in them. That means in 2021, the impact of 1930s, 1940s redlining is that in 2021, there's far less shade trees in those neighborhoods. And so there's a direct tie between historic racism and environmental racism that still exists in 2021, where you just have less trees in predominantly Black, brown, low-income communities compared to the neighborhoods where predominantly white folks live or higher income communities. So querying, the redlining maps with what we're seeing today, there's a lot of overlap in that. And so we have to, again, I'm really big on orienting us in history, that we have to know the history of these spaces. We have to know the history of how our spaces were designed and by whom and for whom, as we consider, again, the historical impact of what we're seeing today. And as we try to dismantle some of these systemic inequities moving forward, that the history part of this is incredibly, incredibly important. So I'll just leave it there for today because I could go on. And certainly this could be a 3-day symposium on just climate equity and climate justice and the historical implications of injustices in South Florida and how those play out today. But I will just leave it with that snapshot, and hopefully we will have an opportunity to continue this conversation, and I would love to continue to be a part of these conversations. So thank you so much for having me.
Hi, everyone. Wow, that was so powerful. We're so lucky to have Nadej as a part of our community, right? Hi, everyone. I'm Zalala Medefris. I'm the Vice President of Policy and Advocacy at Catalyst Miami. I'm also a co-chair of the Miami Climate Alliance. And I have the great pleasure of jumping us into our first panel and following that powerful video from Nadej. So I have Caroline Lewis and Commissioner Nancy Mateer here with me. I've been working with them for years on these issues here in Miami, and I'm just so grateful to be here with you on this panel. So without further ado, I'm just going to jump into the conversation, and I would like to first kick it over to Caroline. And Caroline, I was wondering, I'm sure through the video, many people got the gist, but I'm wondering if you can define climate injustice and climate justice for us. And if there are any, Nadej gave so many wonderful examples, but if there's anything that you didn't mention that comes up for you, particularly through the COVID-19 pandemic, to illustrate that, or otherwise, I think that would be super helpful as well.
Well, thank you, Zelalem. I do agree. Nadej painted such a rich, full picture of the reality and the history, and I truly appreciate that. So I'd like to get to the Q&A. So I'll just tell you quickly how I look at climate justice and climate injustice. First of all, CLEO has been in this business since 2010, right after the compacts formed, and there was so much optimism that the 4-county compact with almost 6 million people, 108 municipalities, would really move the needle. And quite frankly, I think we've done a tremendous job waking up many, many sleeping giants to sort of rally to the climate cause. However, the justice lens is still a difficult one. And I would love the listeners on this call to really start mapping their solutions to climate injustice, so that people that they're engaging. One of the things I'm proud of, Zelalem, and I'll get to your question defining it in a second. One of the things I'm proud of is demanding a seat at the table. Because as Valencia told us, one of the sleeping giants CLEO helped to wake up was Valencia. And I love her quotation when she goes, if you're not at the table, you could be on the menu. And so the fact that so many municipalities in the 4 counties are making room at the table for people to be part of the discussion, it's a definition of procedural justice that goes like this: nothing for us without us. So that they're at the table is a great thing. However, talking about it and taking a pulse and mapping heat islands and understanding where the problems are is so important. But then acting on that information. What are we doing about cooling centers and the lack of AC that Nadej pointed out? So I want to paint the picture of climate justice and the threat multiplier that it is, the climate crisis, this way. People say we're all in the same boat. We're not. We're all in the same storm. The storm being climate disruptions, not just sea level rise and saltwater intrusion and septic tank failure, but food and water and heat and health vulnerability and quality of life issues and prepping for and recovering from hurricanes. So if you picture the storm being all of those things, we're all in the same storm, but some of us are on yachts. Some of us are on motorboats. Some of us are in canoes. Some of us are holding on to a plank of wood. And some of us are just floating in the ocean, hoping to end up in the right place and to get the right leg up. So the climate justice movement has got to be about seeing the inequities in the way our population is. You know, people talk about the federal poverty level, and we keep pushing them to Alice, and you all know Alice is asset limited, income constrained, but employed is the working poor. And that 50% of Florida is poor or working poor. And the fact that all of these municipalities and all of these elected listening are taking a pulse is great, but acting on a pulse, writing policy, doing things, moving the needle so that people floating around on a piece of log or somewhere can visualize a future for themselves that isn't so degraded and dystopic. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Caroline. Always so deep. I love having a chance to hear you speak. I'll turn it over to Commissioner Mateer. so Nadej pointed out that the legacy of discriminatory policies are at the root of racial and social injustice across the United States, and considering environment as well. We talk about redlining or the siting of toxic facilities. So I'm wondering, is there anything, that concerns you in this day about, modern day policies? And then do you have guidance, from your experience on how local governments can avoid continuing this legacy of sacrificing Black and Brown communities for the sake of, I guess, progress? I'm sorry if that's very pointed, but I just going off the cuff.
No, thank you for that question. And it's such an honor to be on this panel with you both. Bold leaders as yourself, you all have been really, truly been leading in South Florida. So just as Caroline had mentioned, it is important that we address these situations and find solutions. And by addressing them, you need to be able to understand these inequalities. You need to see it. And to be an effective legislator, policymaker, you need to be comfortable with addressing these inequalities. And sometimes my colleagues aren't. So what we need to do to be effective leaders is to, one, address the history of inequalities. It's there, and not gaslight it and say that this is not something that happens in this particular municipality, because it has, right? We all know that a lot of the municipalities that have been created were due to white flight populations. And as we move either more north or more west, you're seeing these communities becoming more Black and brown. So first and foremost, let's really address and uncover the biases and inequalities in these charters and these ordinances and undo those policies. I lead from a place of, I'm very self-aware. So I try to really address my biases, and we all have them, right? And to be an effective leader, you have to, one, address your biases, and two, really understand the communities that you're governing. When I lead from a place of inclusivity. I lead from a place of equity. I lead in a place of fairness, in a way that to ensure that my communities are going to be healthy in the future, because it's not about me, it's about us. I also bring to the table a perspective of a Black woman. I don't know if you all know this, but in the history of my city, I'm the first Haitian American, first Black person. That says a lot, because my colleagues may not view a situation the way I would view it. I've been put in situations that have been discriminated against, or I see things differently because of my immigrant background, et cetera. Nadej pointed out climate gentrification. One of the key areas that are currently being gentrified at one of the fastest and most alarming rates right now is Little Haiti, because of its elevation. So really having, as Caroline mentioned, those individuals that are impacted at that table is very, very, very important, because they are able to bring in a different lens. Also, focusing on the present day environmental disparities in our communities. They're not going to go away. We know we're experiencing flooding. What solutions are we putting in place to address flooding? We know our cities are growing. What solutions are we putting in place, or policies that we're putting in place to ensure that as we are growing and developing, we're doing that from an environmental lens? We all have ordinances and building codes in our communities. Are you addressing how development is happening? Are you addressing how land use is being developed on? These are key ways. These are ways that what I bring to the table as I address environmental disparities and inequalities in my communities. When we're talking about affordable housing, are we ensuring that there is central AC? Are we ensuring there's white roofs? Are we ensuring there's green spaces? All of these things are helping us build a stronger community. So for those who are watching today, please attend your commission meetings. Please get on an advisory board or a community board to ensure that you are bringing that perspective, even though you're not an elected official, but your voice really matters, and it tells your elected officials that you're paying attention. I have a saying that I don't know what I don't know. And it's really up to you to really bring those issues to the forefront so I can help address them and us coming together to build that solution.
Coral Springs is very lucky to have you. Thank you so much. If I can, I just want to interject one thing before I go to the next question, and that, it's so important to right the wrongs. And I heard you speaking to that. And I also think many government staff on this call are probably writing climate action plans. Hopefully, it's so exciting to be able to do that. And I just really want to emphasize that number one, you can use those plans and should be using those plans as an opportunity to reduce pollution in communities that are overburdened by pollution, or to bring the green economy and focus that in communities that have been economically shoved to the side for decades. And I also really want to emphasize that it's very, very, very much not okay to offer up these communities that are continually offered up, for sacrifice for the sake of lowering greenhouse gas emissions. That's really, really not okay, and totally, a climate injustice. I think it gets at the crux of something new that we all need to keep our eyes out for as we progress in one way. We don't want to regress in another. All right, I always use this to put in my 2 cents, even though I'm not supposed to as a moderator. So I'll go to the next question, which is, you both spoke to having community members at the table, right? And integrating them in policy work. So I'm wondering, what are your best practices for that? What have you seen that's been really helpful? How can the government staff and elected officials on this call best incorporate community engagement and decision-making into their policies and practices?
Well, let me say this. The city of Miami in particular, and Miami-Dade County, has been so responsive to our outreach work that in a lot of what we do, we have the community at the table. We have an empowering, resilient woman's cohort several times a year, not just in Miami, but throughout the state of Florida. And we really put these, and not exclusively women, but we're targeting women. We put them through a sort of a self-awareness, an education, and a capacity building. And by the end, they are advocating for themselves in their own interest. And doing that in a vacuum will not work. So one of the best practices is to make sure that as you make room at the table for people to find their voices and share their voices, there are people at the table who can respond to these concerns real time and cut out the BS, because paying lip service to major problems and quality of life issues is humongous. Somebody on the chat asked a question about what do we do with a governor who makes these claims that sort of goes against home rule for climate mitigation, goes against the way land use is dealt with. And I think we have got to get a movement in the state of Florida. And I don't know if this is a time or place for this, but I want to drop it. We need to take on Big Ag. We need to take on FDNL. We need to take on the people who are preventing Florida from thriving. And the only way to do that is to stop electing these people who are beholden to these special interests. So you got to do what Nancy did. You got to run for office, folks. We got to take over this thing. And while we're doing that, we got to educate every single person so they're advocating that we all see the common cause of what we need to fight for and that we're doing it. Adaptation is important. And putting $2 billion into infrastructure and adaptation is awesome. But to do that and to think that mitigation is not a problem, it's like my friend Yoka Aditi Rook just said, it's like mopping up the bathroom floor without turning off the faucet. And so at some point, we have to make sure that Florida is a leader in the justice world, in the mitigation world, and in adapting as a vulnerable state.
Great points, Caroline. And if I could add to that, I had mentioned earlier, community advisory boards and committees are extremely important. I got the idea from ensuring that our city divested from fossil fuels from a community board member, right? Was able to bring that up, bring it to the commission, get consensus. And guess what? Our procurement department is now looking at our portfolio and divesting all of our investments out of fossil fuel. So it's so important to include individuals on these advisory and committees, to expanding our participatory budgeting process. Your dollars tells you, or your budget tells you where your priorities are. And if you are able to navigate your budget and ensure that you have a sustainability office, that you have a sustainability officer to address these issues in your city, that's super important. During our strategic planning, I realized that there was a gap. There wasn't anyone in our city that was addressing that. So I brought that up and said, here, we have X amount of dollars here. Why don't we invest in our future? And investing in our future, making sure that we have a climate action plan, which our city does have one, but it's not up to date. And we need someone who's an expert that can bring us up to date. And then lastly, making it easier and more rewarding for folks to register and vote, right? It is so important that we elect individuals who understand that climate change is an issue, that understand the inequalities, that how climate change is a threat multiplier. Yes, individuals, as Caroline had mentioned, are all starting in the storm, but we are hanging on by a thread to weather this storm. So it's important for us to not only elect these individuals, but also support them when they get to office. You can't elect them and let them hang and not bring up issues that impact your communities, not show up for them when they raise these issues. Because guess what? When you're on the dais and your colleague sees all these individuals mobilizing around a particular issue, I guarantee you they'll sway the vote and they'll make the changes that you're asking them to make. But if you don't show up and you're not paying attention, this will continue to happen.
Thank you so much. So I'm gonna go to the audience questions. So we have about 6 minutes left, and I really encourage audience members to get your questions in so we can try to get through them and address them. The first one, actually, I'm gonna answer. There's one aimed at me, so I'm just gonna do that and get it out of the way. It was asking me to explain a bit more about communities being sacrificed for emissions reductions. And I can give one example, and I don't pick on this municipality to say that they are going to act on these things. It's just they have actually a good analysis. So the city of Miami and their greenhouse gas reduction plan actually has a table where they looked at the impacts of climate justice, whether it be neutral, positive, or negative on all their proposed policies. And I think that analysis is important to know, to be able to it shows that they really thought about what are the intended and unintended outcomes of the policies that they have. And so I've been talking with staff about, of course, we'll be working together to amend those, and if it's not possible, not move forward with those that cause increased climate injustice while trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm sure that work will come up later today, and I encourage y'all to check it out. And it's like towards the end of the document that they have this table. That's kind of what I was getting at. But without taking up more time, there's a question. Actually, I think Nancy, this is a great one for you. Someone asked, they wonder if the reason why Little Haiti is undergoing gentrification is its elevation, or just proximity, to being the next gentrified neighborhood, because of the real estate markets, et cetera. So should we be teasing out climate gentrification from regular gentrification, and should the responses be different in each situation?
Well, that is a very complex issue and a very complex question. So I'm going to try my best to answer it to my best abilities. So my personal opinion, Little Haiti is being gentrified because of its proximity, right? It's on higher elevation. It is, folks don't want to live closer to the ocean water, and it's hurting people's pockets. Every other day, your home is flooding. You can't get insured. What does that mean? I need to leave. I need to move out. So the next best step to do is to move somewhere where there is higher elevation. And this is not just happening in Little Haiti. This is happening in Alapata. This is happening in Overtown. This is happening on all these cities that Nadej spoke about earlier in this conversation that had strictly been around redlining and the town for Black and brown individuals, because we weren't deemed desirable, like our lands weren't deemed desirable, and people didn't want to live next to Black and brown folks. So that is one issue. And also affordable housing. Affordable housing is a huge crisis here in Florida. Many of us are barely making ends meet, and people are a paycheck away from poverty. They can't afford where they live. So what they're going to do, they're going to go and start moving into neighborhoods where they can afford. And usually those are neighborhoods that have been disenfranchised for history, for a long time now. And again, those communities are Black and brown communities. So there's a lot. Again, climate change is very, very complex. And when we look at the inequalities and the social economic impacts, it just makes sense that these issues are happening in Black and brown communities.
Thank you. All right, we have room for one more question. We have a lot of good ones in here. Let me go to this one. I think for Caroline, maybe. What has been the most unique community partnership that you've seen in order to increase climate education and action?
That's a big question. I mean, there's no single magic bullet. It takes all of it. I think the biggest thing we can all do is understand the need to be inclusive with each other. I remember when CLEO was established in 2010, and in 2014, when New Florida Majority and Catalyst Miami and all of these social justice groups were getting to the climate table, a lot of my board members were like, oh, this is not good. I said, no, this is great. We've got to have, the problem is so big. Educating the people, the 6 million people in our 4 counties, is so huge. I thought I could do it in 6 months, Alalam. I thought as a science teacher who understands incoming and outgoing heat and climate crisis, I could get that done, but it doesn't. So I think to be genuine in reaching out and working with the communities, for lifting up people in those communities to co-lead with you, to mentor them, to become leaders, those are the best practices. And partnerships between CLEO and Catalyst and UM and FIU and Miami-Dade College and all the counties. It's really an important arms wrapped around each other. And I do want to say this. When we work with these frontline communities or under-resourced communities or low-wealth communities, what's the right word or phrase for them? And for me, listening to people, they believe they are underserved. They believe that even when they bring out the problems and articulate the crisis or the thing they want change, that the cities and the counties are not serving them. And it happened in one of our listening sessions in Sweetwater, low-lying, flood-prone, where the city and the county were present and the residents were complaining, and the city of Miami dude was like going, well, here's my card. You just call me when that happens. And the guy lost it. He goes, I call you and you don't come. So it's about being genuine and being intentional in service to these communities, not just lip service. So that's what I would say.
Thank you so much, Caroline. Thank you so much, Nancy. We'll go to the next panel, but we're all very grateful for your time.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you, Zabalam. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Wow, there was so much there. I can't possibly even begin to do justice to what they shared with us. It was just an incredible level setting and you know, on the ground truth. So thank you again to Nadej, Caroline, Commissioner Nancy Mateer, and of course, our wonderful moderator, Zelalem. Next, we're gonna hear back-to-back presentations from Sona Manat from the Greenlining Institute about how to make equity real in climate programs and initiatives. We'll then transition to Lauren Ross from ACEEE on advancing equity and local clean energy implementation. So we're gonna get both. We're gonna get adaptation and mitigation perspectives from both sides. And then Myra will come in, and Myra Cruz is from Catalyst Miami, and she'll lead a discussion between the two presenters and moderate Q&A from the audience. Thank you, Sona, Lauren, and Myra for sharing your time, your expertise with us today. So now I'll turn it over to Sona.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Just let me know if you can't. Thanks so much for inviting me here today. It's great to be here. My name is Sona Manat, and I'm an Associate Director of Climate Equity at the Greenlining Institute. So Greenlining, just to give some background, is a racial and economic justice public policy organization. We're based in Oakland, but we do statewide advocacy in California. And for today's presentation, I'm excited to share an overview of a framework we developed called Making Equity Real that can be used to ensure that equity is centered and embedded in any sort of climate policies or plans. Next slide, please. And so to kick us off, I just want to briefly unpack why racial equity matters in climate policy to ground us. I'm sure we all know the US has a long history of numerous discriminatory and racist policies over hundreds of years that have really led to the disinvestment and marginalization of Black and Brown communities that we see today. And so I just want to root us in one specific inequitable policy among many, which is redlining. So redlining was the institutionalized and systemic practice of government working with realtors and banks to draw lines around communities of color and deny them access to loans to buy a home or to open a business. And so on this slide here, I have a map, an example of a redlining map from Oakland. And the neighborhoods are graded based on a color code that signified the level of risk of lending money to that part of the city. And so you can see the different colors on the map here. Green meant best, blue meant desirable, yellow meant declining, and red meant hazardous. And the primary indicator of risk was race. And you can see an audit on the bottom of the screen from surveyors from the city of Oakland that includes offensive language, and it explicitly names the infiltration of Negroes and Orientals as a detrimental influence on this particular community and the reason for its redlining. And between 1932 and 1962, when a lot of redlining was taking place, the federal government backed over $120 billion of loans, but more than 98% of that went to white families. And so this lack of investment in communities of color, particularly Black communities, has led to the extreme wealth inequality that we see today along race lines. Next slide. And I want to show what we are seeing today and how the past connects with the present. Even though redlining is technically illegal now, it's resulted in several harmful health, environmental, and socioeconomic impacts from decades of underinvestment in low-income communities of color. And so this slide has three maps, all of Southeast Florida. So the left is a redlining map, the middle is a social vulnerability index, and the map on the right is a COVID map, with communities in red having the highest COVID rates. And what I want to point out here is that you can immediately see that communities that were redlined over 80 years ago continue to be heavily impacted by not only climate change threats today, but other different crises like COVID. Next slide. And so the key takeaway here is that the environmental injustices, extreme wealth inequality, and legacy of racism that we really continue to see today across the country are a result of very intentional discriminatory and race-based policies of the past. And it's also why, as we move into the future, we have to be explicit about race and equity to address the disparities that we're seeing today along race lines. So I now want to introduce you to our framework called Making Equity Real. We've developed this framework because equity, as you all know, is becoming a very popular buzzword these days. And there's a risk that equity can turn into an empty promise if there's no strategy on how we actually achieve that promise. Next slide. So here is the framework itself. And if there's one thing you walk away with from today, it's these 4 steps that I'm about to go over. So for any climate policy, project, or plan, equity has to be embedded in the goals, the process, the implementation, and the analysis. And our theory is that equity has to show up in all 4 categories to create the strongest outcomes for historically marginalized communities. And we have to be explicit about it. Because again, we don't want equity to just be a commitment, it has to be a practice. So now I'm gonna go into each step. Next slide, please. So step 1 is embedding equity into the goals of a climate policy or plan. And before diving into this, this is all from a report we published, so no pressure to remember all of this. Happy to share the resources later on. So our full report includes a series of questions to think about when developing goals for a climate project or plan. For instance, what's the definition of shared equity we're using? What are the specific frontline communities that are the focus of the plan? And will the climate resilience benefits of the plan or project be accessible to different frontline communities? A good example of an equity-centered goals that we like to point to is from the LA County's sustainability plan. So for this plan, equity is built into almost all of the 12 goals. And I have 2 as an example here. Goal 1 talks about healthy and resilient communities and specifically mentions low income and communities of color. And goal 3 talks about the importance of equitable land development and development without displacement, which I know was a topic from the last panel. Next slide, please. Step 2 is embedding equity into the process of a policy or plan. We call this procedural equity, which is how we work together and who makes the decisions. And that procedural equity is just as important as distributive equity, which is focused on the outcomes of a project. So again, some questions to think through here. First is a big one. How is power shared? How is the project governed by community members, or how is it governed collaboratively? For community engagement, we ask how the process will be designed to collaborate with different frontline communities, and how will it be accessible to people who, for instance, don't speak English or don't have access to technology, for example. I mean, you can see the full set of questions in the report online. This is just a snapshot. And we've also included the spectrum of community engagement to ownership, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which can be a very useful evaluative tool when working with local government. Next slide. So step 3 is implementation of the plan or project. And some guiding questions here to center equity in the implementation of a climate plan or project. The biggest one is, how does the effort address community identified needs? And our report has guidance on how to conduct equitable vulnerability assessments as a first step to identify community needs. Vulnerability assessments should assess not only the climate or hazard exposure risk, but also adaptive capacity of frontline communities, like access to air conditioning or transportation, and sensitivity factors like homelessness or immigration status, because all of these can exacerbate an individual's vulnerability to a climate threat. And so I have a really good example of equitable implementation that I wanted to share. This is from a California context. So Pacoima Beautiful is a grassroots environmental justice organization in California that's been leading a project that's investing $23 million from a state grant program to create comprehensive GHG reducing and resilient strategies in the San Fernando Valley in California over about a 5 square mile radius. The project's really clear on its equity goals. It wants a vision around building neighborhoods that are safe, green, and resilient to climate change. And they've just started capital construction on public transit, active transportation, rooftop solar, and greening projects. And what's really significant about this project is that it's entirely led by community. They're the only grantee in this grant program where a nonprofit entity is the lead grantee rather than a local or regional government. And because the project has done a good job of centering equity in both its goals and its processes, this project is able to build in equitable results and benefits. And so I want to unpack this implementation piece a little bit more and provide some more guidance on how to develop equitable implementation strategies, because the Pacoima Beautiful project is one of the only examples of project implementation that we've seen where it's entirely community-led. It's usually not the case. And just thinking big picture, this Making Equity Real framework that I'm going through can be a very helpful structure for how do we build in equity into a climate plan. But what's missing from these 4 categories, goals, process, implementation, and analysis, is how do we figure out what are the specific equity goals and implementation strategies for the specific climate plan that you all might be working on? That really depends on the current conditions in a community. For instance, are there strong relationships between community groups and local government? Is there enough trust? Is there adequate funding and capacity to do the work? And so to help answer these questions, I want to briefly share another tool we use to assess what we call the equity readiness of local government. Next slide. So the equity readiness tool that's up here on the slide was developed by Capua Consulting, an organization that offers strategic equity advising, leadership, and training. And this tool is used to assess government and community equity readiness to work on climate plans and projects together. And so I'm just going to walk us through how this tool is structured. So the first part of the tool asks the government entity to answer questions like the ones that I have here on the right. What is the government's understanding of institutional racism? What's the budget for engagement? What are the existing relationships and level of trust with EJ communities and so on? And there are about 25 questions in total. And then there are 4 options to answer each question. 1 is not at all. For instance, there's no understanding of institutional racism. 2 is that they're starting to understand it. 3, it's well established. And 4, it's the norm. And each of these 4 responses has a numerical value attached to it. For instance, if there's no understanding of institutionalized racism, that's 0 points. If it's the norm, there's 4 points. And you can do this for all 25 questions, and you end up with a score from 0 to 100. And I just want to point out that it's not about how high or low the score is. We want our government partners to be very honest and realistic about where they think they're at, so that we can figure out what is the starting point for equity strategies for this particular climate project. And so as an example, a city that I'm working with in California ended up with a score of 40. Next slide, please. And so what did this score tell us? Well, the Capua Consulting assessment tool, they developed a spectrum of equity strategies that you can see on this slide. If the total score is 0 to 25, the recommendation is that the government entity prioritize relationship building in whatever the climate plan or project is. If the score is up to 50, the government should prioritize inclusive access as well as relationship building, because the strategies are meant to be cumulative. And since the city we're working with ended up with a score of 40, it put us in between relationship building and inclusive access. And the idea is that this is what the city's equity strategy should focus on for this climate plan. And the score of 40 also indicated that the city is likely not ready for a culture shift or power shift, because those things can't happen unless there's significant relationship building and inclusive access. So the goal of this tool is to identify a city's current capacity and understanding of equity in order to develop strategies that both stretch the equity work, but also don't overextend to the point of harming communities that the plan is trying to impact. And the idea is that if we're able to prioritize relationship building and inclusive access and do it well, then we'll set ourselves up to move into culture shift and hopefully power shift. Next slide, please. And then here's the last piece of that tool. Once you know what the equity goal should be for the plan, the tool then provides specific strategies that you can implement. So I know there's a lot on this slide, but if you look on the left in the section that I've outlined in blue, those are the different categories for strategies. They include things like budget, community engagement, staff time, decision-making process, and so on. And next to each of those categories are the specific strategies. So for instance, for relationship building, the strategies should include investing in existing events within the community for engagement, building cultural competency, having transparency about decision-making, and identifying issues that are existing community concerns. And I'm happy to share this slide deck as well after, so you can review and read these strategies. Next slide. So that was just a new tool that we started using in our work that I wanted to share because it's been really helpful. But to get us back on track with the Making Equity Real framework, the fourth and last step is analysis. And this is often the hardest step. I think the field is still evolving in terms of how do we measure for procedural and distributive equity. But we offer some guiding questions in our report to consider around accountability, adaptive management, and communication. I encourage you to review these in our report if you're interested in learning more about them. I think the most important thing to note here is that the equity metrics will largely depend on the equity goals that you develop. So there's no one size fits all for equity metrics. They have to be customized and adapted to the specific project's goals. Next slide, please. And so that's the Making Equity Real framework. And it was a lot of information, but again, happy to share more resources so you can dive deeper into that. And yeah, hopefully this was a helpful way to think about one way to center equity in the work that you're all doing. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Sona, for that. Next, we will hand it off to Lauren Ross, who's the Senior Director of Policy for ACEEE. Thank you for being here with us.
Great, thanks, Myra. Doesn't look like I have the authority to turn on my video. Here we go. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to speak today. I'm really happy to be here. I'll be talking, moving a little bit higher ground than the first panel and continuing on Sonia's framework and providing more of a kind of bird's eye view of how cities in their clean energy implementation are adopting some equity frameworks or more equity driven efforts in this space. Next slide. And so just a quick overview of ACEEE for those of you not familiar. We are the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. We're a nonprofit based in DC, focused on research and policy analysis to advance energy efficiency, broadly policies, programs, technologies, and behaviors. I'm the Senior Director of Policy, but for the last 7 years led our local policy work, which was basically our work with cities and informs a lot of our conversation today. Next slide. So I don't want to spend too much on the equity framework here. I think that Sonia really hit the key points that I wanted to highlight both in this slide and the next. But as I said, in the goal of this presentation is really to provide for you all an overview of how cities are embedding equity principles in their clean energy actions. ACEEE evaluates cities, states, utilities in a number of ways based on clean energy adoption. And over the years, we've really tried to provide guidance and include equity in our evaluations. In terms of a framework or how we as an organization have been approaching equity, we've used the framework that I present on the slide. Again, Sonia spoke to some of these elements, but we wanted to see the extent to which cities and others were focusing on authentic engagement with communities, how decisions addressed historical and present day inequities, how outcomes were distributed across communities, and how policies and programs considered intergenerational impacts. Next slide. And when you kind of look at us all together, this image helps define what we consider to be an equitable energy system, recognizing kind of those 4 elements of equity in policies, programs, and decision-making. Next slide. And I'll say as an organization, one way that we've approached or examined energy and has been looking at energy burdens, and that is the proportion of income that households spend on their energy bills. And we thought that this would be a way to help those in and outside the energy space make sense of some of the inequities. I think it's a present day indicator, but reflects some of those long-standing inequities in how different groups access energy, experience the cost and burdens of energy production as well. And so here I'll just, highlight some of the main kind of discrepancies. The median energy we have found nationally for low-income households is 3 times higher than it is for non-low-income households. Native American households spend on average 40% higher or experience an energy burden 45% higher than their white non-Hispanic counterparts. For Black households, that is 43% higher, and for Hispanic households, 20% higher. Next slide. And here, the dotted line represents the median energy burden for households, and you can see the different groups that have an energy burden kind of way above the median. Low-income households, communities of color, older households, those on a fixed income, manufactured housing, renters versus owners. And here's an overview. And if you jump to the next slide, I present kind of the web page and where all this information lives. We also have one-pagers on some of the some one-pagers for certain cities where data was available on energy burdens, Miami being one of them. And I just want to take a minute here and say that we have found that energy burden data has brought others into this space in thinking about energy equity. It has gotten sustainability officials, elected officials to really, to make energy equity a little bit more tangible, to make the case for energy efficiency more tangible to policymakers and a wider audience. And I really think it's broadened the base of support for more equitable policies that relate to clean energy. And so that's been helpful. And as I'll get to in a little bit, we're seeing more and more cities. I always feel like cities are ahead of the curve when it comes to equity, a great resource that I hope will inform state and federal action going forward. But more and more cities are actually designing policies around targeting highly energy burdened households. So that's some ways in which we've seen this body of work resonate with policymakers and others. Next slide. But, and I'll say too, before moving into our research, energy burdens are just a piece of the story. Energy inequity really carries with it health burdens, safety, comfort, and resilience, and really affects how those are able to access good indoor air quality, the way they weather storms. Energy really cuts across and reflects many of the longstanding inequities in our communities. Next slide. And here I just highlight some additional energy sector inequities that we have found to be a priority for how communities approach clean energy. And that is, addressing the lack of access to energy saving technologies among certain marginalized communities, addressing exclusion from the workforce, the unjust health burdens that are related to high energy burdens and lack of access to clean and affordable energy. And the same thing with building wealth. Next slide. So that's kind of the framework in which ACEEE as a national organization has began to better center equity across our research and policy work. For years and years now, maybe going on 15 or so years, we have been releasing policy scorecards, both city, state, and utility scorecards, all focused on really benchmarking and driving clean energy action at those levels with the goal of identifying best practices and really setting a high bar for clean energy leaders. So in all of our scorecards, there's always a number one, and we're identifying again who's the clean energy leader. But reflecting on that, we have recognized that we really haven't ensured that those leaders center equity in their policies and programs. And that probably needs some help in doing so as well. And so over the last 5 or so years, we've really increased our metrics that focus on equity, especially in our city scorecard. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that today. Next slide. So briefly, for those of you unfamiliar, ACEEE produces every year a city clean energy scorecard. It ranks 100 cities, basically 100 of the largest cities, on their efforts to advance clean energy, both solar and efficiency. We look across local government operations, community-wide initiatives, transportation, buildings, and what the utilities that serve those cities are doing as well. And next slide. And as I said, we've really focused, especially in our work with cities, being that equity is central for so many elected officials in cities, looking at better incorporating and weighting metrics that really emphasize equity. Some of the things that we've surveyed cities on has been to the extent to which the utility programs in their cities reach low income and multifamily residents, how the state of access to affordable public transportation and the proximity of affordable housing to transit-oriented development. We've looked at workforce development programs and jobs programs on behalf of cities as they relate to clean energy. We also looked at incentives and financing on behalf of cities to promote energy efficiency and affordable housing, also on-site solar generation that targets low-income communities. And I probably should have started with this, but in terms of procedural equity, we have a strong focus on climate and clean energy planning, the extent to which community is involved, extent to which decisions are in the hands of community members, and then accountability to social equity. This year, we'll also be including metrics that look at utility and city relationships and those that also bring in community-based organizations as well. We're particularly surveying community-based organizations to hear their perspective. We're also looking at equitable approaches to distributed energy resources in cities. Next slide. So I thought I'd just share some insights from the data we're collecting right now for the 2021 City Clean Energy Scorecard. And I think it's important to note that we are seeing progress among cities when it comes to equitable clean energy implementation. I'd still categorize that as emerging. It's about almost a third of cities now have integrated equity more along many of the metrics that I've measured. This is probably up from a quarter last year and probably at the same rate the year before. I think we hear no shortage of discussion among cities, but there's still a lot of learning to do in terms of actually getting policies and programs in place. We are seeing a growing number of cities where community members are playing a larger role in the design and implementation of key climate and energy actions. They're undertaking better efforts to reach marginalized groups, and in some cases offering these groups a formal decision-making body or role, I should say, in climate action. And less so, but again, increasingly more setting practices for accountability to some of the social equity outcomes that they hope to see. We're seeing most progress around utility programs, connecting communities and affordable housing to existing transit, and also workforce development. So I would say more cities, when it comes to equitable clean energy, these are the areas that they're most actively working in addition to the kind of procedural equity piece in terms of bringing communities to the table. Next slide. And here I thought it'd be interesting just to list some of the examples of what we're seeing. I also think that this list reflects some of the foundational activities that we're seeing. And Sonia talked about goals as the first step, and that cities are still working their way along the framework or the steps that she provided. We're very much seeing the same when we analyze this across these 100 cities. Many cities are in the process right now of setting goals. And so whether it's reaching highly burdened communities or working towards a goal where energy burdens will go down across the city, we're seeing more of that. We're also seeing more committees like here in Providence, where committees are being set up or processes are being set up that all legislation in cities will have to go through some racial impact analysis. So we're seeing a lot of, I think I'd consider them foundational activities to set the cities up for more success in terms of equitable outcomes. Next slide. And I'd be happy in Q&A to talk a little bit more about some of those city examples that we're seeing and the ways in which cities are approaching. equity in that goal setting and strategy phase. I also tried to here take a step back and think about where cities are, what are the issues that they're grappling with, where's more research needed, where's more evaluation needed. I'd say in general, and we often get the question, well, what are the outcomes? And it's great that cities are implementing these policies, but where are they in terms of evaluation? There's not a lot of evaluation happening at the city space. What ACEEE does is categorize the policies in place, and we provide a lot of data on that, so we can help benchmark cities, identify the leaders, and all of the information I provided today. And there's a link in one of the slides to our database where we provide all this information. But in terms of really getting into some of the policy outcomes, and analysis of how things are working, to reiterate what Sonia said, a lot of cities just aren't there yet. So I think in general, we are looking for ways to identify the best practices for equitable local energy efficiency strategies, clean energy approaches. We have categorized a lot of the good approaches, but in terms of identifying best practices based on outcomes, that's still a bit, we're just not there yet. Some of the key topics that I think are of real interest to researchers these days is the implications for electrification and affordable housing. What will be some of the distributional benefits as cities investing in electrification and other decarbonization efforts? Is it feasible? What are the impacts? And I think in general, I see my time is almost up, so I'll just quickly say that in terms of the opportunities that we see going forward, I think there's a strong need for further evaluation on a lot of what I presented today. Also, increased engagement with community-based organizations to further the structural and distributional equity elements of these approaches. And hopefully that's a next step for many of you on the call now. And we also see guidance for, a need for guidance for rural policymakers. I think I saw a question on that in the Q&A earlier. And some of the challenges in rural areas around energy equity are much different than what we're seeing in urban areas, and they need some more tailored guidance there. Okay, I think next and final slide. I just wanted to flag a new initiative. As I mentioned, we do the city, state, and utility scorecards. Our city scorecard, about 20% of the metrics really focus on equity, ensuring that the leaders have a strong emphasis on equity. We're trying to get there with our state and utility scorecards as well. Data is always an issue, but we are working with a group of advocates and community-based organizations to include more equity metrics with the goal of better enabling communities, advocates to hold state, local, and utilities, state and local officials and utilities accountable for equity in these in their strategies. Our scorecards are a ranking, but they're extremely, if you ever looked at the report, they usually near about 200 pages and really serve as a roadmap for city and local action on clean energy. And the idea is that we want all of our recommendations to be better geared towards more equitable outcomes. And so we're working with community-based organizations and others to restructure them now. So with that, I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. That was extremely informational. I love how you really walked us through how to do some of this implementation work, which is really oftentimes kind of the hardest part. First, it's getting started and then actually getting to the point where you're like, okay, how do we actually make this happen? What are the steps we need to get there? So we have a ton of amazing questions coming in from the audience. So we'll just get started there. I think the first question, I will send it to Sona. It's something I'm personally interested in because this is work that we're trying to do in Miami as well. But someone asked if you have any guidance on how an advisory board can help inform the city commission regarding climate justice. Have you seen good examples of this in cities where you have worked?
Hi, thank you so much for that question. Yes, absolutely. I think community advisory boards are extremely important to being able to just provide perspectives that data may not capture around how their lived experiences are, how they're experiencing climate impacts, and be able to provide those perspectives to different policies that local governments are working on. And the report that we worked on, what we actually did was go through every single climate resilience policy that California's developed and highlight best practices from it. And so we've cataloged all of the different policies. These are at the state level, but they can be replicated at a local level that have advisory boards. What are the devil's often in the details? So making sure, for instance, that they're resourced, that they're compensated, that it's very clear on how their input is going to be taken into consideration to inform decisions that are being made. And so that report has a whole catalog, but overall, I would say, I think that's one really helpful touch point to ensure that equity considerations from communities, particularly frontline community groups, are included. And I think one just nuance I would offer is that it's helpful to have dedicated frontline community advisory groups to make sure that there is a space where their voices are being heard, uplifted. Oftentimes in our advocacy, we're often outnumbered by more mainstream, bigger enviro groups that are focusing on very important issues like natural resources. But it often comes at the expense of the EJ advocates who may not be able to have their voices heard. So I think dedicating spaces for them to share their perspectives can also be very helpful.
Thank you for that. And I just have a follow-up for you because it kind of relates actually to the next question. But oftentimes you need the money to make these things work. So how should a city go about doing that? What are like budget processes that we've seen maybe that have been effective? How do you kind of justify and make, the investment make sense for someone that might have like a really tight budget? It might not seem like a priority. How do you make that argument?
Yes, I think funding is always the biggest barrier to all of the work we're doing, especially when it comes to resourcing community groups, because in at least the work we've done, that's now becoming a norm, but it's still taking some time for that to be fully established. I mean, I think that's the role of a lot of advocates and environmental justice organizations. Whenever we're doing our budget advocacy, in addition to the specific programs around resilience or mitigation that we're advocating for, we want to make sure that we're advocating for funding for the procedural equity pieces, a lot of what Lauren discussed. So we want to make sure that there are line items in budgets for community engagement, not only engagement that would include advisory boards, but also capacity building. Because if there are under-resourced organizations that want to participate, but don't have the staff capacity to be able to do that, then they won't be able to participate. There isn't that access there. So I think budget advocacy is really important. We're in the middle of that right now in California. And I also think as plans and policies are being developed, it's very helpful, for instance, for different climate action plans, to get involved in the work that local governments are doing where you all might be located, and to really advocate for there to be, I think someone mentioned like an equity screening tool. And part of that would include having a frontline community advisory group or some other body that can really hold that entire decision-making process accountable to making sure not only is there an equity screening tool, but it's implemented and considered throughout the process.
Absolutely. I hope people are writing down those really helpful nuggets. Lauren, I have a couple of questions for you that came from the audience. I think one is just really helpful to kind of ground us more in what you were talking about when it comes to energy burden, but do we know what factors are driving the disproportionate cost when it comes to energy burden? This person wrote some different examples, like it could be lower energy efficiency housing, higher energy use, lower shade cover, more frequent occupation of homes. But if there are there specific factors? Is it usually a combination? Like what are you usually seeing?
Sure. So we have looked at this, and not in such a granular way. It really does vary by locality, but in general, we see that it's a factor of income, which certainly drives energy burdens, but we also use as a proxy for efficiency, energy intensity. So it's relative energy use relative to square footage, and do find that, and other research has supported this as well, that low-income households on a per square footage basis tend to use more energy, suggesting that appliances in the house housing, building shell of the house all play a part in the efficiency, and also the REC survey by Department of Energy has also found lower penetration of energy efficient appliances among low-income households as well. So income is a factor, but we also know that energy intensity is also a major factor, and efficiency is at play. We also know that the demand for low-income energy efficiency programs, as well as weatherization, really outstrip the resources available, and the waiting list in most places is really long. Again, suggesting that there's just not the resources at scale that these households need to be able to upgrade.
Because you touched upon this, and there's a question about this, and I think it's super relevant given all the money that we're hearing that's coming down from the federal level potentially. But the Department of Energy stimulus funding that was made available to cities under the Obama administration really helped to stimulate municipal action to advance efficiency and clean energy, and support staff and project implementation and stimulate markets and job creation. Are there similar funds coming down the pipeline? And so feel free to chime in if there's anything that you've heard about as well.
Sure. We think that's highly likely in the jobs plan. We are gathering resources on our end to support states and cities' readiness if such funding is made available. We like to see it go to clean energy in a way that is equitable. We have more and more examples now at the city and state level about or around good approaches, better approaches to clean energy that address longstanding inequities, that seek to maximize health impacts and job impacts from such investments. And so I'd encourage all those in the meeting to be prepared for if and when those funds are available. ACEEE will be providing program guidance for best practices of what's being done elsewhere and detailed program models that you may want to consider adjusting or tailoring for your own needs. But I think that equity has to be in the front. And there's, it's not a trade-off. It's to what Salam said earlier. We don't need to be thinking about, we need to put people first. We need to put equity first. And that all, climate energy strategies doesn't need to be a trade-off though between equity and reducing carbon emissions. We know we can do both, and we have to do both, right? And so, yeah, I'm hopeful that we'll see funds, and I hope we can put resources and share guidance on what funds might be able to be used for.
Thank you so much. I'll open up this next audience question to you both, because I feel like you both might have different perspectives on this that would be helpful. But what are the key enabling conditions in cities that are further ahead when it comes to decarbonization and progressive utility policy, et cetera? For example, do these cities operate their own utilities or rely on investor-owned utilities? Are these cities responding to state policies, or are they leading with their own policies and are ahead of their respective states? So I'll have someone start first, and then we'll go back to Lauren.
Thanks, Myra. I'm definitely not an expert on decarbonization or utilities, but we have a separate energy team at Greenlining, and they actually came up with an entire kind of decarbonization report that focuses on vehicle and building electrification. And I definitely encourage folks to read that. I'm happy to share a link to those resources. I think it's becoming a very hot topic right now, especially given the new federal administration that we have. So yeah, I'm sorry, I can't provide more specifics, but happy to share a resource on that.
Yes, and we have, especially in the context of the city scorecard, responded to concerns. Can cities lead when states are holding them back? when home rule comes into play. What are cities able to do? And it would be wrong to suggest that states don't provide barriers. They do. And where we see cities leading, it often is a context where they have more progressive utilities that are investing in efficiency, in states that are holding utilities accountable to investing in efficiency. And there's kind of a more culture of addressing climate and energy. But we also find, especially in the Southeast, cities kind of paving the way for climate and energy action on behalf of states and utilities. I think Atlanta is a good example of that with benchmarking. They started requiring more of their utility, and using different approaches to hold utilities accountable and getting the community involved, and talked about that earlier in terms of building the momentum across the state. I think too that especially when it to not just Southeast Florida, but Southeast in general, we often find cities as the leaders in the region. And the extent to which they can organize across the state and put pressure on state officials to recognize the multiple benefits of climate and energy action is an area of opportunity. I'd say it's a mixed bag when it comes to what cities can do with states and utilities that don't cooperate. It does certainly provide or present a challenge. But we've seen some cities develop voluntary partnerships with their utility, getting beyond just mandated policies or requirements, and develop productive relationships and engagements with community priorities and need to a differing degree. And of course, it is dependent on the utility and the state. Hopefully that answers some of that question.
It is, it's complicated. There's so many factors to take into account. So I think it is definitely a question that requires some nuance, which you hit at. We have time for maybe like one more question. I'll send this to Sona. Many local governments in Southeast Florida have already taken steps to develop a vulnerability assessment. Others are just starting this process, and for the first time, the state has significant funding to support local governments in conducting these vulnerability assessments. Can you talk about why it is critical to think about vulnerability assessments beyond just physical infrastructure and climate hazards, and provide some specific guidance on how local governments should go about incorporating socioeconomic data and vulnerabilities into these assessments?
Sure, thanks, Myra. I think it's a great question. I think if we're only looking at climate hazard risk or exposure risk, we're really not getting the full picture of which communities, which individuals and neighborhoods are the most vulnerable. I think many communities in Southeast Florida are very vulnerable to sea level rise, but if we're only looking at hazard risk, but some of those communities have financial resources to get a hotel or an Airbnb during a flooding event or a hurricane. I'm from New Orleans originally, so I definitely know what that feels like. Or to go stay somewhere, just to escape the weather, the climate disaster, or if they have, infrastructure within their own home that protects their home for flooding, or transportation to escape extreme weather events, that puts them in a very different position from other communities who may not have access to those resources, who will therefore be much more vulnerable to the threat of sea level rise, flooding, hurricanes, whatever the climate threat might be. And then these factors, which really focus on adaptive capacity and sensitivity, which I talked about a little bit, can really be a make or break kind of decision point for whether or not communities are able to survive and get through those different climate disasters. And so I think when we're doing vulnerability assessments, it's so critical to be sure we're including those social vulnerability pieces so that we can get the most holistic picture of who is most at risk. And I'll just say, I think the term vulnerable communities, frontline communities, gets thrown around so often, but in most places I've seen, there isn't a standard or a metric to really define what that means. In some ways, every single community is vulnerable to climate change. So I think the precursor before we even get to vulnerability assessments is to figure out, how do we identify those that are most vulnerable? What's the data that we need? And just as an example, I'm currently working with some other EJ partners on developing a climate mapping tool that looks at all of this holistic data from climate risk exposure, adaptive capacity, like access to transportation, safe transit, AC, et cetera, as well as sensitivity factors, income level, if folks are homeless or experiencing houselessness, to really get a sense of which communities are most impacted by these different climate threats, and to then be able to develop vulnerability assessments to address those needs. And then I think what's really key is to make sure that that data and those mapping tools are tied to policy and investment allocation. So they're not just kind of sitting there, but they're actively being used by our decision makers at the state, local, or regional level.
Thank you both so much. I think we're at time, but thank you both for all the wonderful information that you shared. The chat was really active with a bunch of amazing resources. I'm sure those will be sent out to everyone, but thank you both, Lauren and Sona. You really provided a lot of helpful information that is really needed to ensure we get the implementation right when we're talking about these issues. So thank you both for your expertise and for all the work that you've been doing.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Myra, Lauren, and Sona. We really appreciate your time and expertise. And now we'll transition into a short break. We're asking everyone to please come back at 3 p.m. sharp for the remaining session, which is going to be a great conversation. So please come back at 3 p.m. sharp, an 8-minute break at this point. And thanks for tuning in. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your break. We are really in for a treat this afternoon, an entire session focused on community engagement and partnership. I want a couple reminders as if just in case there are anybody that is just joining us. This webinar is being recorded. It'll be posted on the Compact's website in the coming days. All our attendees are muted. If you have technical difficulties, please use the Q&A box and someone will reach out to you for help. And finally, a link to the agenda and our speakers, full bios and emails are provided in the chat right now. So go ahead and check that out if you haven't already. You know, we have actual practitioners in the field who are going to help us understand what are the best practices. And so today we have Phoebe Romero from the City of Austin, who will provide an overview of the Cities of Austin's first climate equity plan, and that I'm sure we'll take good lessons away from. We're then going to move into a moderated discussion to hear from on-the-ground examples. We're lucky to be joined by Nicole Crooks, a Catalyst Miami Community Engagement Coordinator for Overtown, and that's a community in Miami for those of you who aren't local. Alyssa Farina, she's the Resilience Program Manager for the City of Miami and a crucial part of Resilience 305. We also have Ike Powell, Senior Program Specialist for Outreach and Community Programming in the Youth Services Department in Palm Beach County. But we're also lucky to be joined by Rebecca Fishman-Lipsey. She's the President and CEO of the Miami Foundation, who will be both moderating and leading the Q&A for. We're lucky to have Rebecca, who brings a wealth of experience from her prior work in the community and really understands the important role that philanthropy plays in working with local governments to advance equitable solutions. Thank you for joining us, Rebecca. And I'll go ahead and kick it off to Phoebe.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. As noted, my name is Phoebe Romero. I work with the City of Austin Office of Sustainability, and I'll be providing an overview of our Austin Climate Equity Plan process. So we can go to the next slide. So before we kick off, I really wanted to first touch on our definition of equity at the city. We follow the lead of our equity office and lead with race. And so equity is defined by racial equity, and it's the condition when race no longer predicts a person's quality of life outcomes in our community. We can go to the next slide. And so when we think about racial equity and climate change and all of the different intersections, we put together with our steering committee a list of 7 themes. We reviewed a lot of other plans that had done equity evaluation tools and really took the themes with inspiration from those. And so I'll go over how we took these themes and created an equity evaluation tool to review all of our strategies, but really wanted to just show this intersection here and to also know, because of all of the disparities in our city and because of all of the racial injustice and all of the history that we discussed, that if we're not proactively addressing equity, then we're perpetuating ongoing injustice. Next slide. And so I'm going to go over some community involvement. Next slide. So this is the structure of how we chose to revise our plan. We had a steering committee that did a lot of the big picture outlook and helped put together our equity evaluation tool. And then we had topic specific advisory groups from transportation to natural systems. And then we tried a new pilot initiative, which I'll get into, called the Community Climate Ambassadors Program. And that was really to have on the ground conversations led by community members that have relationships with their neighbors and that have that sort of leadership experience and can provide lived experience as well. And so next slide. And so I mentioned, with our steering committee partners, we really try to be intentional and not have just big green organizations represented. So we had some big institutions like universities, including our local HBCU, some environmental justice and social justice organizations, health and homelessness organizations, and to make sure that we had a varied and diverse perspective of local equity and social justice organizations. And we did this as well for the advisory groups, but because those are a little bit more topic focused, we tried to ask, are you interested in transportation or buildings, and try to, place people in those groups from there. So we can go to the next slide. And so our ambassadors program is something new that we tried that was really successful. We ended up having a recruitment process and had funding for 12 ambassadors to pay them at a rate of $20 an hour. And in the end, we ended up with 12 ambassadors, and we really built a template to choose these based off of their ability to apply an equity lens, their lived or historical experience, and their ability to facilitate authentic conversations. And so it was 12 of them in total, and they ended up facilitating conversations via gatherings to hone in on the concerns and priorities of their communities. There was a setback with COVID-19. A lot of them were going to do in-person gatherings, but they did a wonderful job of shifting to either video calls or phone calls or even paper surveys in some cases. And so in the end, it was great. We had high school students, we had elders, and an amazing, really group of individuals. Next slide. And so these were some of the key priorities and concerns that we heard. We took all of the transcripts from the interviews and did some coding. Our community engagement specialist did a wonderful job of taking all of these. And so what we heard over and over is that people were really concerned about climate resilience, climate preparedness, extreme weather, racial equity, pollution. And so even though this plan specifically is a mitigation plan to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, it's really important that we have that lens, that people really care about the climate impacts, people really care about displacement and equity. And so that's the lens that we have to do our engagement and our outreach with. So next slide. And I'm bringing back up these themes again from our equity tool, because what we found from these different concerns that kept coming up about affordable housing and preparedness and food access, all of them relate in so many ways back to those 7 themes that we put together for our equity tool. And so we really wanted to make that connection between what we heard on the ground from our ambassadors and then what our steering committee helped us also focus on. So we'll go to the next slide. And so now I'm going to touch on our equity training that we did for all of our participants. Go to the next slide. So there were 2 key tenets of this equity training. We hired a local environmental justice organizer who works with Indigenous communities and had done some work with Sierra Club. And he focused on ensuring that all of our participants really understood our local history. This is going to resonate with a lot of what's been said, but Austin has a history of redlining and has a history of, after that redlining process in the 1928 master plan, creating those zones to be industrial development zones. And so that led to a lot of hazardous facilities being located in neighborhoods. And so we were very lucky to have Poder and Susana Almanza represented on our steering committee. Her work really was monumental in getting those facilities relocated off of the east side of Austin. And now, the current lens that we need to have with this work is that many of the communities that fought for the relocation of these facilities are now being displaced via gentrification. Austin has a declining African-American population. And so it's just really important that we recognize these, that not just history, but this ongoing injustice. And so next slide. Another key part of the equity training was this justice litmus tool, as Dr. Tanya Ward put it. He basically took the tenets of white supremacy culture from Tema Okune's work and asked these questions and went over some antidotes. And there are several, and I encourage everybody to read up on those, but these are the ones that really came up quite a bit in our process and that we had to keep reflecting on throughout our meetings, which is when you're talking about climate change, sense of urgency is a big thing because everybody wants to solve it and solve it now. But we need to, again, realize that a lot of mistakes have been made in planning processes. And so we need to take our time to do it well. Climate versus equity, which one are we addressing? Again, thinking that you can't separate those two and you have to address both of them. Paternalism, valuing academic experience and PhDs over lived experience. That's really going to limit our perspectives when addressing this issue. And then again, when you're having conversations on race, fear of open conflict and right to comfort is a big thing where people are not wanting to lean into these conversations. So what can we do to step out of those comfort zones? And then lastly, developing leaders on a horizontal basis and valuing all perspectives equally so that we can have those rich perspectives and be more nuanced. So next slide. And then next slide. This is our equity tool. So we really took the process from Government Alliance on race and equity. And again, starting off with the history, training everybody so that they understand local history, disaggregating data to know, maps, really understanding where the disparities lie, and then ensuring that our strategies and our goals didn't just address carbon emissions, but also had equity components. This was an iterative process. We used this equity tool and rewrote things. And then lastly, with step 6, we're still waiting to get the plan approved by our city council. So accountability and communicating results and transparency is still a part that will be ongoing, right? Back to that funding conversation as well. Next slide. And so these are our 7, again, themes, and we created 3 to 4 questions for each theme. And if you go to the next slide, yeah, you can see, I'm sorry that the text is a little light, but basically, with health, we defined what health means in this particular context, and then ask questions like, does the proposed action reduce air pollution and therefore potentially reduce asthma and other respiratory related hospital visits, right? And so people that were filling out this tool as a group with their advisory groups then, looked at, okay, this action is either causing harm, being neutral, or potentially causing a benefit. If it is causing harm, then we really took the time to have that conversation as to what we can do to mitigate or eliminate that harm altogether. What are the mechanisms that have to be in place, either funding or policy-wise, to ensure, that issues like further displacement don't occur. And again, this is all just really taking the time to think about it because we don't have all the answers right now, right? It's an ongoing process. So we can go next. And so in the end, we ended up with 17 goals and 75 strategies. Our goals are to 2030. We are aiming to be net zero by 2040, so really making our goal more aggressive. And throughout this process, what we found as recurring themes is really prioritizing incentives, outreach, communications on communities of color and low-income communities, and centering them in our ongoing learning and data, qualitative and quantitative data collection process, focusing on jobs, anti-displacement, and then of course health. And so next steps here are that we are going to be seeking council approval, hopefully by the end of the summer, and continue that relationship building that we've worked hard to start at the beginning of our process. And then of course, funding options are going to be really important. And we have a fellow from Environmental Defense Fund with us this summer that's going to focus on looking and doing some research and having a report on funding options for these. And that's it. The next slide just has my email and some links. So that'll be shared over to you, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Phoebe, that was incredible. It was really incredible. It was such a pleasure to listen to you present, and that I totally understand why you were invited to share your expertise. So I'm going to filter a couple questions your way. And again, I'm Rebecca. I'm the president of the Miami Foundation. Really a pleasure to get to know you. The purpose of today's conversation is really thinking about the importance of community engagement and the connection between government and community. And so this was a really great way to tee us up. We have a couple questions. We'll only have time for a few of them in this portion, but then after we have the larger conversation, hopefully we'll be able to weave in some more of those questions. So one of the questions that came in was related to concerns from the community that may not on their face seem like they're climate related specifically. So I'm curious, how did the resilience and sustainability staff work across departments on your ends in order to address more intersectional issues? And if you have any suggestions on how to break out of the silos.
Sure. So yeah, that's a really good point about faith groups. We actually did, our community engagement specialists did a lot of phone calls, and back before COVID, did a lot of flyer drop-offs at local churches. We recognize that to be a very important place for this type of recruitment. One of our ambassadors was actually a church mentor and did some outreach work based on that. And so a couple of our community members definitely were involved with their local church communities and used that lens. So, you know, again, we're still working on making sure that we have as much diverse representation from the community, right? You know, one of the lessons learned was definitely that our Asian community was not as present in our ambassador work or throughout our process. So that is certainly something that we want to make sure to target in the future, for example. So hopefully, and then as far as like, you know, organizations that aren't necessarily climate focused, that was another big part of our work. It was, you know, we consulted with our equity office a lot. Our equity office has these ongoing community meetings on a monthly basis, and they have a big network of people that you know, are trusted networks. And so we did a lot of outreach through consulting with them, and really just if an organization focused on social racial justice, we tried to bring them in, because again, we wanted to say, you know, we're not just here for the big green organizations. You don't have to be a technical expert. This was a really small thing, but our advisory groups initially were called technical advisory groups, and we removed the term technical because of that same barrier, you know, people being like, well, I don't, you know, I'm not a science person, and really making sure that it was more open in that way.
Wow, you're hitting on a bunch of points that I know we're going to discuss as a whole group. Just one more question for you before we invite everybody else in. Love how fearless you all are about saying your commitment to equity, defining your terms, and being clear about your focus. Curious if that was coming from the top, or whether that was coming from elected leadership or being driven at the staff level. What was the direction of that choice?
Yes, so that was from our equity office. And, you know, I do want to give a lot of credit because they have fought a lot of those battles from the beginning. Our equity office is fairly new. I think 2016 is when it was started or founded. And I believe that they work a lot with the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, and USDN, I think, also has a lot of great equity foundations work that also focuses on leading with race. Now, did we have, you know, well, what about like the whataboutism when it comes to equity? Well, what about people, you know, experiencing disabilities, or people, the LGBTQIA plus community, or sexism, right? And the question here is, yes, all of those things we did make sure to have representation from these communities across our different groups. But, you know, we really wanted people to understand that, you know, back to that intersectionality, when you have that issue, plus you have you know, you're dealing with racism, then, you know, that's just the common denominator oftentimes. And that when you disaggregate that data, that's what shows up. And so again, you know, we definitely had a lot of conversations. That's why I recommend a thing like an equity training, because then you have someone who is very experienced in that facilitation. We also have an undoing racism training through the People's Institute of Survival and Beyond that we're trying to, the equity office is trying to get a lot of city employees to go through. And that is a 2.5-day training that is amazing, that really explains the importance of race and the way that, you know, the concept of race has played out injustices in our institutions.
Love it, Phoebe. And knowing that there are a lot of practitioners on the line today who want to bring and echo the spirit of what you all are doing out there to their community, to their teams, if you could rewind back for yourself and think about what were some of the most important first dominoes that needed to fall in order to make teams comfortable to take risks being direct about race and equity as the grounding force of the work. What were, so like, if you wanted to give people advice of these are the 2 things to try to do first, what would you say to do first?
Well, one thing that I think is very important is, you know, if you are going to be doing work to do outreach to communities, you need to have somebody on your team that already has those community connections, that is already an organizer, because that made all the difference. Our community engagement specialist had already worked with Susana Almanza Poder, had already started an environmental justice community. She was very young, but she had a lot of community connections and had been with our office before. And so that's one thing. It's like hire people to be part of your staff. And then another thing is, you know, make sure that your staff is also trained in facilitation and conflict management and equity, because if we as you know, a team don't have those foundational concepts down and we're trying to facilitate a conversation on these topics, it's going to be very, very difficult. And so definitely, you know, have a person that's going to be on your team that's going to help guide you, and then make sure that your team is all on the same page. Like, we are moving forward with, you know, racial equity and climate change together. And this is, you know, the process. And, you know, people really do, like, there's been so many transformations throughout this process, but the foundation of making sure that the spaces that you're building are safe and that have that shared language, I think is really important.
Love it. Love it. Thank you for setting the stage for this discussion. I'm so excited to open up and bring our other speakers who are here for today's discussion. We have an all-star cast. So I'm going to ask if all three of you would join in, come in on video. We have Ike Powell, we have Alyssa Farina, and we have Nicole Crooks. And it is such an honor to share this conversation with you all. I think the first place to start, hopefully, is for you to introduce yourselves a bit, so that we shared your bios, and so people know quite how impressive you are. And so instead of relaying all of the things that you are and do, maybe we'll just start with just the briefest of what you're up to in this moment and why this topic of connection between community and government is so important to you. And then we'll get rolling. So I'm going to start first. Ike, can we throw it over to you first for a quick intro?
Certainly. Thank you, Rebecca. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ike Powell with Palm Beach County Youth Services. As you heard and you'll see in my bio, I serve in the capacity of the Senior Program Specialist here at Palm Beach County. And in that role, I have several responsibilities. One is leading our countywide My Brother's Keeper network, which is focused on racial equity. So here's a population we're focused on: our young men and boys of color. We're focusing on improving their life outcomes, which includes their educational as well as employment outcomes. And we do that work through a collective impact model. Right now, I'm currently, and I'm excited to announce, I've brought on a new corporate partner, and they have provided us some minimal funding, but we're very much appreciative of that, to help move the needle towards their outcomes, their educational as well as the employment outcomes. It gives us another opportunity to further engage the community, to provide our young people with access, equitable access to more opportunities, more job opportunities, career exploration opportunities, where they can live and thrive. I'm also involved in a collective impact initiative here in the county that we started 5 years ago. It's called Birth to 22. So this is an alliance of more than 200 agencies, youth serving agencies, that convened 13 community conversations to gather input from the community, input on what are their needs, where are the gaps in terms of services, what are the challenges they're facing. From there came a youth master plan that we use to guide our vision and our responsibility as it relates to funding opportunities. We continue to have those conversations. We're planning to have more conversations within the next couple months, specifically when school comes back, to hear from our young people, especially culturally based, culturally relevant conversations. We haven't had any conversations that focus the language in Spanish nor Creole, so we're planning to do those conversations in those specific languages. And I'll just let that rest there for a moment and be respectful of my time.
Awesome. Thanks, Ike. Nicole, let's pass it to you. Will you do a brief intro and just explain a bit about why this is your zone as well?
All right. Well, hi. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicole Crooks. I'm a proud resident of Overtown, which is in Miami, Florida, and also the Catalyst Miami Community Engagement Coordinator for the Overtown community. And so I'm extremely passionate about this work. I'm relatively new into the environmental and climate justice space, but super excited because with my introduction, actually through Cleo, it started to open the doors for me to make it very clear as to how significant this space was for me and people who look like me. But the fact that we're often not reflected in this space, and that the conversations that take place are not necessarily in a language that we feel as though we are able to connect to. And so that led me on this whole journey that actually even helped to build a path to Radical Partners, where my sister friend and I were able to participate in an incubator and develop a program specifically geared toward Black women and environmental justice and well-being. Understanding that at the root of everything is wellness, is equity, is healing, justice, restorative practices. And so just really and truly being so grateful to be able to be in this space and to be a part of helping to lead a group of community champions who are taking up the banner in a huge way and leading the charge in Overtown in a space that I often call ground zero of ground zero. So thank you so much for allowing me to be in this space among so much excellence. I'm super excited for how this panel is going to go. And I turn it back to you, Rebecca.
Thanks, Nicole. And it was such a pleasure to get to know you through that Radical Partners program and to be reunited with you here today. So Alyssa, I'm going to pass it over to you just for a brief intro and a bit about why this topic is centered to your core as well.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'll say, I think there's a lot of synergy between myself and Phoebe here in thinking about the ways that, you know, strategy development and these big plans can be vehicles for considering equity and developing equity and better relationships in the community. So, you know, hats off to Phoebe for the amazing work. So my name's Alyssa Farina. I work for the City of Miami's Division of Resilience and Sustainability. And that's in the Public Works Department. I lead on carbon mitigation efforts for the city, but also kind of lead our department or division in community outreach, engagement, and communications. I joined the city in 2017 to help with our King Tide Awareness Program. And then since then have worked on a number of strategies, including Resilient 305 and have to plug that there. Our Miami Forever Climate Ready Adaptation Plan, and most recently our Greenhouse Gas Reduction Plan, Miami Forever Carbon Neutral. And then before that, I was an informal environmental educator on the Miami Science Barge, which I feel was a critical component in my contextual kind of understanding of who are the stakeholders and you know, the way that climate is discussed in the community. And I feel like I carry that kind of experience, and those relationships have been really important to me in my work as, you know, a government communicator and a government worker. And so, yeah, just the development of those three strategies have taught me a few different things, and I'm eager to have this discussion and kind of share some of the findings that we made along the way of developing all of those projects.
Love it. So I know everybody who's tuning in is with me in saying that this is an all-star cast. So Phoebe, Alyssa, Nicole, Ike, we've got a little bit less than an hour to cover a lot of grounds. I'm going to ask some questions centrally, and then we'll open it up for Q&A at the end. The hope is knowing this is a very impressive audience today that's tuning in of practitioners and leaders in our space. And so we wanted this to be really practical, really actionable. So to drill down to the hows and the specific techniques that you're using is the space we want to play in. So Ike, maybe we'll start with you for the first question and dial in a bit on the youth program that you mentioned earlier. You have a master plan that you created for youth, and as opposed to dropping it on high to youth, you actually included youth in the creation of it in a really powerful way. So maybe we'll start there with kind of user-centered design and how you make sure in the projects that you're doing, and in that one in particular, that the user is involved in the shaping of what's created.
Certainly. So one of the things we were able to develop as part of the Youth Master Plan is we've developed what's called a Youth Advisory Council. And they serve as the youth voice as it relates to youth needs here throughout Palm Beach County. They're referred to as future leaders. So it's double. They serve as the youth voice. They also have the opportunity to develop their leadership skills. They've all been trained in how to facilitate meetings on their own in terms of Robert's Rules of Orders and how to engage one in conversations. We, the adults, assist them and support them in those conversations. Two of them happen to serve on the Birth to 22 countywide, what we call steering committee. So the steering committee is made up, obviously, of leaders of the various youth serving organizations that ultimately make the final decisions. And I think it's so impressive to hear directly from these two youth that serve on that committee, lending their voice, bringing back what the other youth have said. And in many instances, they've been able to provide suggestions, provide recommendations that have been incorporated into the updates as we update the plan. And also they provide suggestions as to where they feel more funding is needed, where there are gaps in services.
Well, it's really impressive the way that you do that. And it sounds like you're not just investing in them to help shape this plan, but you're investing in them and their future leadership, training them on how to use those Roberts rules. And, you know, I think some of that, it adds layers of complexity to what it is that you're doing, but you're training them to be advocates right now and for the future. So that's neat.
Yeah, I just want to say, Rebecca, also, we're working to empower them them that hopefully one day they can serve on some of these organizations, for example, nonprofit boards. They feel more comfortable going in front of city, county commissions and lending their voice.
Yeah, and they are wanted there and they are needed there. So you're setting them up for that on-ramp. I love that. So would love next to talk maybe to Nicole and Phoebe a bit about trust and mistrust in the relationship between government and community. And I would say in particular in a year like this that was punctuated by distance and punctuated by mistrust in our institutions. I think it's harder than ever for residents to feel trust in the leaders that represent them. And you both have done a lot of work to try to forge that kind of trust. So maybe we'll start with you first, Nicole, and you can speak to this from your work either at Catalyst or through the really beautiful effort that you have co-led related to the Black Butterfly Collective, just thinking about the importance of the creation of that trust, the recognizing of mistrust, and like, what do you do to fix that?
So Phoebe, I wanted to thank you and acknowledge the work that you're doing. And there's so many pieces, so many layers that I can absolutely relate to, that we can relate to as a community. And so when we start to talk about and really talking about dismantling and addressing and calling a thing in terms of white supremacy culture and recognizing that it's woven into all of the politics that are a part of our reality in the current moment, right? And so really taking the time to acknowledge the history and the harms and the pain and the trauma that has happened historically, but is currently happening even now, right? And so when we talk about building the trust, we have to start from a place where we're really acknowledging the truth of where we are. And in terms of trying to heal that, really looking at things and allowing people to tell their own stories through their own voices. I think what happens very often is that other people are recalling our history and it looks very different from the realities that we're experiencing, right? And so really being able to slow down and hear the stories of people. One of the most beautiful things that happened most recently was a partnership. It was a partnership between the university and the city and a lot of different departments, as well as the community champions here in Overtown, where there was a photo voice project that we embarked upon, where pictures were taken and then memories were recalled. The one that just continues to touch me is thinking about a lot where there was a tree that existed, where a family would go to get their food, even when they did not have the ability to purchase their own food. They had this tree that was able to sustain them. And to think about the way in which the development has started to come and displace things like those trees, right? In very subtle and overt ways, but for example, one of the biggest things, which is also a win, it was a loss, but it was a win. And sometimes we have to lose to win. I think that was a song too. But to be able to recognize that, so at one point when we talk about the community advisory boards, we had a community advisory board here in Overtown. And because of politics, it was kind of undermined and displaced. And thankfully, we're in a space where now we're able to have it reinstated. But during that process, what we were supposed to be able to do was to make sure that anything that was going to come into Overtown in terms of development, in terms of displacement, we were supposed to be able to have a say. And the fact that that happened and so many things like that happen so regularly, it really does undermine the trust. But when the community starts to feel as though they do have a voice, and so people are really listening, and that we really do have allies along this journey, it helps to rebuild the trust that was squandered, really.
You said so many powerful things. First of all, also just amplifying your message about the importance of listening, but also the importance of stories, really hearing people. I'm going to remember the story about the tree for weeks after this. There's something about the imagery that sticks. And so to give people enough time, not just to say their 2-minute comment, but to really get into the why for them and their story, I think really matters through your comments. So Nicole, thanks for that. So Phoebe, would love to turn it to you, but maybe flip the question a bit, talking about trust. Let's say impact happens at the speed of trust, but it's a two-way street. I think the community needs to feel trust, but also the government needs to feel safe to be trusting and trusted as well. And I see there being a lot of fear. I remember when I served on the Florida Board of Education, we would have open comment for a couple of minutes, but we were terrified about what people might bring in those moments. And as a result, really tried to script what people could comment about, in what ways. We limited the ability for the community to really provide input out of fear. And so I'm curious on your ends, how do you see the building of trust with communities, not just to make sure that the community's voice is heard, but that elected leaders and government teams feel safe to create that kind of vulnerability for themselves?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think oftentimes traditional city or government engagement is really oriented at checking the box. It's we're just going to have this big town hall and we're going to listen to you, but we don't want to listen to you too much. So we're going to limit the way that you can, these 3-minute, 1-minute kind of time checks that you have at these council meetings and things like that. So we definitely experienced that. I think one of the biggest things, and there was a question here in the Q&A about how do you build trust, right, when you don't have some of the equity office or these institutions. And it's really, it comes down to, I think, having a fair amount of honesty. I think one of the things that an organizer that we met with at the beginning told us is you really need to think about, having a power analysis. And that's something that we did, but I wish we had done it more, because it's really important, I think, for community members to also understand what kind of power we have as staff, right? And for us to be honest about that, here's how I feel, here's how our office feels, here's what we're trying to do. But at the end of the day, we are in a hierarchical organization that's top down, and that's who makes the decisions on funding, that's who makes decisions on implementation and accountability. And we found that just being honest about that and saying it out loud was actually well received, because people then understand that, and this is especially important, I think, as well for big green organizations or people who have the ear of elected officials to know and understand the type of advocacy that they need to be doing in order to support the work on the ground. And there are a lot of organizations, in our community that are really, really good at that type of organizing and pushing policy. And so again, I think the honesty, yes, the fear of hearing honest feedback. I think oftentimes there's a sort of defensiveness about some of the unintended consequences that policies in Austin have had. Austin is a very conservation friendly city. There's a lot of amazing policies that have been done to preserve natural resources. But, some of those, a lot of that was done on the west side of town and led to a lot of development happening on the east side of town. And that's a sensitive topic because it wasn't intended to be that way, but that's just what happened, right? And so I think one way to combat that fear is to say, you will continue to be called out by the community, and rightfully so, if you aren't taking some of that feedback and trying to actually prevent those unintended consequences from happening, right? And so, yeah, in the end, you pay more with not listening, and my opinion, but honesty is a big thing.
So Phoebe, we may need to double click in later again to talk about that power analysis, because that's fascinating and actionable. And so we may come back to you about that soon. But first I want to pass it to Alyssa. Alyssa, I know we've had conversations about this in the past. At times when we're doing the work related to environmental things and scientific things, it can get a bit wonky. And in getting wonky, it can create distance between communities and those who are kind of in the government space doing the work. And so I know you've done a lot to think about how to make the work accessible, and especially when it gets into wonky territory. So would you talk a bit about how you approach that?
Yeah, definitely. So for us, we have come to approach kind of engagement from the frame of, we don't want to be asking the community for solutions explicitly. There are wonky people who have ideas about, exactly what we should be doing, and we welcome that. But we've tried to really approach, when we go out for feedback on things, when we did our climate adaptation plan, we focus a lot on, here are what the climate impacts in Miami are: heat, extreme intensifying storms, sea level rise. Then we showed people maps. What does this mean specifically to your neighborhood? Because that hyper local connection, in the context of their neighborhood, they're not thinking about, the neighborhood over there. They're thinking about their lived experience. And then we said, based on this information, based on your lived experience, how does this impact you in your daily life? And frame it always in, how can we bring this back to someone's lived experience? And just talk about things in that way. So then when it came to right now, we're working on our greenhouse gas reduction plan. We're not asking people, what should we do? Or what do you think about, a energy benchmarking policy? That's so inaccessible. But what we can say is, if you had information about how much energy your building used, would that be useful to you? How would that change your life? What would that do for you? And start thinking about, what is the intended impacts of the things that we're pushing forward, and frame it as, how would that impact your life? Or what have been barriers to you, pursuing this type of action that we're pushing forward now? So again, just stepping out of the policy and thinking about the impact, and talking about the impact or the outcome or the lived experience of people has been a lot more productive for us. And also, as Phoebe was kind of mentioning some of that kind of shared language, and thinking about setting the foundation of climate literacy and getting everyone on the same page. Nicole and I co-ran a meeting, and she helped us really dial back some of the language we were using to not be super jargony, and talk about really the fundamentals of climate change. That way people felt informed. And then when we could have the conversation, they could start introducing language that was new, but also explicitly built the bridge between, their lived experience and what climate was. Because a lot of people are thinking about, they have climate experiences, but they don't know that it is. So as, the government or people who have more expertise, we can help explicitly build that bridge, and they can bring their lived experience to the table. And then we can help, kind of merge these experiences.
This is really, really practical advice, Alyssa. So would love for the three of you that are involved on the government side of the house, would love to talk a bit about one of the places where the rubber meets the road, which is budgeting, and how to make sure that on the budgeting work that the community is engaged, understands the consequences of the choices being made, and has a voice in that process. So maybe, if you're okay with it, starting with you, Ike, a bit about any thoughts you have about how to engage the community more meaningfully in understanding the budgeting process and having a voice in it.
Certainly. Thank you, Rebecca. one way is through the community conversations that I mentioned in my introductions. That was extremely helpful for us, like I said, in the development of our youth services master plan. 13 community conversations held community-wide. And we continue those conversations even though the plan has been developed for some time now, to get feedback on how we're doing on the plan, what's working, what's not working, as I said before, where are the gaps. In terms of community input as it relates to the budget, here in the Youth Services Department, we engage the community, we provide opportunities for them to respond to formal solicitations, procurements that we have that drive the service directions. We have some very specific outcomes, standard outcomes that we have identified would help not only the youth, but their families. And many of those outcomes are equity-based. So for example, if a community-based organization is receiving funding from us to work with youth and families, what type of trainings have they had? We strongly encourage in their solicitation and follow through to talk about and budget for trainings that are racial equity trainings, cultural competency trainings, gender identification trainings, opportunities where they would have conversations with the community and the youth that they serve around bringing the unconsciousness to a consciousness, I call it, explicit and implicit bias, for example, and gathering and understanding. Someone mentioned earlier about the importance of understanding the history. So all of that occurs through these type of trainings, and that helps benefit the county as well as the community.
Really helpful. Phoebe, Alyssa, anything to add on the budgeting side of the house?
I would just say it's really challenging, and it's one of those things that is very, again, kind of the top down. So from the individual department level, it's, even challenging from within to advocate on the budget. So I think I feel really, I feel for the public, but it's one of those things that where you can get a few people or a group of individuals pushing for the same thing, it speaks very loudly. And it's one of the, I would say, one of the most critical times a year to be in public advocacy. Like if you're going to push your community groups to participate civically any time of the year, it would have to be the budget cycle, because that sets the tone for the whole year. So I think it's just really important for community groups that are listening to know that that is the time to speak your priorities out loud to the people, call your electeds, all of that. And I know that that's always the advice, but it really works. It really does.
It's really effective, eerily effective. So I'm going to be moving to audience Q&A in just a couple minutes. I have one or two questions left, so I want to encourage you. I see a bunch of questions coming in, but if you haven't asked yours yet, make sure you get it into the Q&A box. So Nicole, would love to pass the next question to you. It's especially relevant this past year as so many things went digital. My first reaction when I saw some of these public comment and kind of community engagement efforts going digital was that I was going to make so much more inclusive for people who never could show up in the middle of a work day to come to something, now be able to zoom in and make comments or engage. But at the same time, it also can make it increasingly less accessible for people who don't have access to technology or aren't as comfortable in that space. So curious how you're seeing the matrix of accessibility through use of technology, and what you would advise on the government side of the house to make sure that all community members are able to have a voice.
Thank you. So one of the things that I absolutely noticed is that back in 2001, I was really advocating regarding the digital divide in New York. And we're 20 years later in Miami, when across the bridge, there's Wi-Fi access for most on the beach. And so really being able to create the infrastructure, and I know that there is work being done currently, gratefully, to be able to get all of our young people online. But even when we talk about our elders, so in terms of the training, being able to have accessibility to computers, universal Wi-Fi is not really out of the question, I don't believe, at this point. So I think that that's something that's huge. Definitely being able to have comments via the telephone, and really having a welcoming space. Because the other reality, Rebecca, I have to say, is that yes, there was the ability to engage a lot easier by way of computer and by way of telephone, calling in and so on and so forth. But what happened a lot was that community members were really shut down and they were really disrespected in those spaces. And so I think that it's very important that the elected officials, right, first and foremost, understand the importance of the lived experiences, right? And the fact that the people that they are representing, their voices deserve to be heard, need to be heard, and need to feel valued. The other piece is creating spaces in which community members, because of history, like when we talk about the history, a lot of times they're scared to be in spaces and elevate their voices because they feel repercussions will be coming. And so really being able to create a space in which people understand how powerful they really are, right? And getting the support necessary so that they can empower themselves and recognize that everything they have to say is valued and valuable, right? And so I think that that's a community effort, understanding the power of Ubuntu, which means I am because we are, and we are because I am. And just recognizing the interconnectedness of us. We need each other, right? And we're not going to get through this thing without each other, right? So just honoring and respecting and rooting everything from a place of love, transparency, authenticity, and healing.
Nicole, I could listen to you all day. I want to listen to you all day. I need more Nicole Crooks in my life. So we have so many good questions from the audience. I want to switch over there and pepper you with some of the questions from the community that's tuning in. It's really impressive list. So some of them are very practical and some of them are more in-depth and analytical. But Phoebe, let's start with you. There's a practical question in here about the task force that you led. How long was the engagement and how often did the task force meet?
Yes, thank you. And I wasn't sure if I was supposed to like type it out. So I was like, well, I'll give it a try. So we were originally going to meet for 6 months on a biweekly basis, which is why we knew that could be a barrier. And we offered to provide people with stipends. And we really like, there wasn't a whole lot of, because we were like, do we have an application? We just said, if you need to be financially compensated, please get in touch. And we ended up having maybe 10 to 12 people get in touch. So it wasn't this thing where it was like, everyone was like, oh yeah, I want to get paid. Like it was really like an honest, exchange. And so, we did still recognize, evening meetings is not something we did. And so we tried to get some like high school students to show up, and that was harder for them, right? Which is why the ambassador model is important, because then you have people meeting on their own time. But yes, so we met on a biweekly basis at the beginning. Then we had working groups within each task force, actually get together and meet even more frequently when we were really getting down to writing. And then towards the end, we met on a monthly basis. And now, again, we're not really checking in because we're waiting for the plan to get approved. But we did have a check-in with the buildings group after Winter Storm Uri, because it was such a big, huge blackout, huge inequities. And so we kind of started to think, okay, since this plan's not approved, what amendments can we make in context of that?
Got it. So this next question is not geared towards anyone in particular. So any of you who feel like you can give the advice, please do. It's from somebody who represents a smaller city and doesn't have some of the ingredients that were mentioned in some of the projects that have been successful in this panel. So they may not have an equity office or groups already of trusting and highly engaged BIPOC or low-income community members, and they want to start to create buy-in. What would you recommend that they do to get started?
Anyone want to go first?
I wrote something in there, but I'd rather somebody else take it.
So again, for me, it's always being able to provide the opportunity for one to hear their voice, to lend their voice. And many times that means meeting them where they are. And Nicole was alluding to that as well, being able to meet them where they are. So that would be key, and being able to engage them as much as possible in the work, in the planning of the work, and continuation of the work. And also being able to educate them as well through the much needed trainings, as I already mentioned, the racial equity trainings, helping them to understand the difference between implicit, explicit bias, encouraging them to lend their voice in council commission meetings, encouraging them to communicate directly with their representatives, not only locally, but at the national level, at the state and national level.
Really helpful. And if I could throw in 2 cents, I would say in the absence of a perfect solution, don't do nothing. And that I see a lot of people being fearful to start because they don't think they have all of the necessary ingredients. And if you don't, you have to start. You have to take the baby steps forward. So whether it's some of the trainings that Ike mentioned or the creation of a small task force within your team, take a step. So Phoebe, one more question for you related to the power analysis. I'm so glad someone asked because I'm very curious. Can you talk a bit more about the power analysis? What is that? How does it work? Get real granular.
Yeah, so this was a tool that I think was part of USDN's Equity Foundation's training. And so I mentioned that we had a community engagement specialist who had been an equity fellow. She actually participated in the USDN's Equity Fellowship Program. So I encourage for cities to look into whether, you know, they're placing them in your city, because it's an amazing program. And so it's basically a quadrant, and you're looking at what organizations are most impacted, or what communities are most impacted by the decision that you're making, and then who has the most influence. And so then you're looking at, you know, low influence but high impact, low influence, low impact, high influence, high impact, right? And so once you map them out in these quadrants, and I'll try to find the template, but then you can begin to say, okay, for example, somebody mentioned, you know, developers, right? And the leverage that they have, and the impact that they have. And so what are going to be your engagement strategies for them versus a community, you know, based organization that represents and works directly with people who are impacted with flooding. And just having that, again, kind of like the equity tool, where it's like, it's not going to give you all the answers, but it's going to give you a place to start getting an analysis of how that works, and what the action points there are. And so we did that at the beginning, had, you know, a discussion on it, but again, it's like, especially as we're getting down to getting this plan approved and the funding, that's when it becomes most important. So I imagine we'll pull that back up as we move into implementation and really start thinking about that again.
Got it. So next question, maybe a good one for you, Alyssa, but anyone who can help would be valued. We have a question here from the chairman of the City of Hallandale Beach Sustainability and Flood Mitigation Advisory Board. So excited that you're here with us. Any guidance on how we might start mapping our city for climate inequity? I can help advise the city commissioners, but I'm not sure where to begin.
Oh, that is, of course, a huge project. And I will say a resource that I love that I will point people to is the city of Richmond did a really great climate equity map of their city. You know, it's one of those projects that can be totally endless if you, you know, decide that you just want to add this data set and that data set and whatever. So I think figuring out for your community, what is the important data sets for determining, you know, what does an equity outcome mean to your community? But this map is fabulous. And I found it through a New York Times article, speaking all the way back to what Nadej was talking about this morning of the overlap of redlining and extreme heat and tree canopy. That was kind of an analysis that they did. And then they brought in social vulnerability information and flood information, repetitive flood loss, to try and, you know, add all these layers so people can create the maps that they want to see of the climate equity issues in their community. So I think just, again, starting with the analysis of, you know, what are the key data sets outside of, you know, your typical climate vulnerability assessment, and starting there, and then you can start to build after that. But I would really check out the city of Richmond. They had a really great initiative on this.
Awesome. Phoebe, we got one more for you. Do you have a sense of how much the community engagement component of the work cost your city?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So we have a, our internal city or Office of Sustainability budget that we get. And so during this process, we basically allocated that funding to an ambassadors program, to helping fund participants, and to fund the equity training, right? And so I think oftentimes, when people are writing climate plans, they will use a consultant to do that community engagement and pay the consultant and pay them for creating the climate plan. And so basically it would be, instead of allocating that funding to a consultant, it would be, trying to allocate it directly to the community, and then, trusting the people that are leading that work to be able to draft something that is, rooted in community, rooted in the science, all of those things. And so, again, specific numbers, I don't have it off the top of my head, but I know that we didn't use any extra budget from our typical Office of Sustainability budget. It was just reallocated. In a big picture way, there's a transportation project that the city of Austin is doing called Project Connect that went to the ballot box, that is being funded with property tax. That's huge because it's going to completely revitalize our public transit. And a big portion, or not a big portion, but a couple $100,000 of that are being used for anti-displacement. And that was through a lot of community advocacy. There's still thoughts that that's not enough, considering it's a $multi-$1 million project. That being said, when it comes to these bigger things, we do often have to go to the ballot box, but because this engagement was, fit into our office budget, it was really about prioritizing what we would be using it in.
Got it. So Nicole, this next question might be good for you. I'm in a very small city, and I'm honestly not sure if there are even any community-based organizations to start having those one-on-one conversations besides churches. I've been here for 3 years, and other than churches, mosques, there's no community organizing that I'm aware of. I'm at a loss about how to start this work. Suggestions on how to get community engagement when there may not be intermediary orgs with whom to partner.
Okay, thank you for that question. And so a couple of things come to mind. The first, I have to be so very honest, is here in Overtown, I decided to start leading a team with that is a national model. It's called Girl Trek. And even when we're talking about learning about equity in the communities and learning about walkability and some of the things that are facing, like when you talk about heat, you learn a lot by walking through a community, right? And so initially when Girl Trek, and they can be found at girltrek.org, just wanted to put that plug in. But initially when I started doing the Girl Trek walks here in Overtown, I started by myself, right? Just walking and literally, because my faith is everything to me, praying about the healing of my community. So that's what it started with, just walking every single day. Girl Trek started with 2 friends. It is now a 1.5, it's a 1.5 million. It's a movement, it's not a moment. And so it's in developing the relationships, it's in being consistent and showing up for people. It's learning about people in your community, learning about the things that are needed. One of the things that I learned through Girl Trek is that people are dying from loneliness more than even smoking cigarettes. So when we talk about the importance of connecting and really honoring your neighbors, knowing who they are and what they need is everything in creating a sense of resilience, right? Like trust each other. When I talk about the power of Ubuntu, I'm not just saying that, like I believe that. And there are going to be moments that are going to be really scary to get started, but just trust the fact, like I love Brene Brown, right? Love her. One of the things that she said is, I'm not here to be right, I'm here to get it right. And that takes so much pressure off of us, right? Like if we're willing to fall and scrape our knees and know that we are going to be able to get back up, we'll throw ourselves out there. We'll throw ourselves out there to be vulnerable so that we can be resilient. And so just get out, meet your neighbors, find the people who need you, right? Start to build a movement. It's not a moment, it is a movement, and we can do this, we can get this done because we are wired for connection. Renee says that too. In my mind, she's one of my besties, right? But like, we're wired for connection, so we gotta connect, basically.
Love the invocation of Brene Brown. And one thought, knowing that you have the ingredients of the churches and mosques in your community, I find when I'm searching for neighborhood heroes, it's often the first place I start. The churches know. And so to call up and ask, who are the neighborhood heroes in this community? They know. And so that's always the lead for me of how to get nominations for prizes, awards, and recognition for neighborhood heroes. They know. So I would start there. And Nicole, love your message. So Alyssa, somebody asked a question here for you, just to clarify one of the comments that you made earlier when we were talking about the kind of input you're looking for from the community. And you got real practical and said, you know, this is the type of stuff we've realized is most impactful to ask about. This is not the stuff that we ask about. And one of the things you mentioned was not sourcing solutions from the community, but rather grounding in their experience. And someone just wanted to clarify, just knowing that people who are experiencing an inequity are the experts of their own experience. And so wanting to hear solutions from the source in that way could be valuable. So just wanted you to clarify what you meant before when you said that.
Yeah, and I apologize if I misspoke there. The kind of intention of what I was saying was what we've heard from people in the past is, you know, climate seems very overwhelming, very daunting, very technical. So what we've tried to do is just take it a step back and say, you know, we're not asking you for, you know, the technology solution, the policy. We absolutely welcome that information, and there are people who have those solutions and we want to hear them. And I think a great way to let the community know that you're speaking is one, through multiple engagements throughout the life of a project, just not like at one point. For this recent project we're doing, we've done, you know, an early stage where we didn't have any actions planned and we just wanted people's feedback on like a few general ideas. And that's a good way to tell people that you're listening because you literally have nothing. And then, you know, a later on point whereas maybe your more traditional feedback period type of thing. So, you know, the idea just being that when you approach, you know, a group of people who may be a bit timid to engage on the issue, you can say, you know, you don't need to tell us, you know, that we need, you know, solar panels of this kind in this place, but maybe they are interested in talking about, you know, having solar panels and batteries seems really interesting to us, and they can have it at that very high level. And just the comment is just to keep it at a high level that's accessible for people, and you know, try to avoid getting too deep in the weeds. Unless people are ready to go there, then like be ready to go there.
Awesome. So I know when sitting on a panel, often later in that day, I'll realize, you know, there's this thing I didn't get to say. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open the floor for all four of our panelists to just say, like, what is the thing you wish you could have said you didn't get to say, so that you can close out our thoughts. But my one last question for the group is, you know, communities that are experiencing climate change first and worst are simultaneously experiencing a variety of other challenges that at times can feel or look more pressing. And so the question is, like, how do you connect the dots between what feels pressing and climate change and climate resilience to make people prioritize this issue now? I open that to anyone who wants to answer.
I'll just go quickly and then leave it to others. But I always feel like climate change is like the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon game. Like, there's no issue that I can think of that cannot be tied to climate change. So like, it's so interdisciplinary. It's something that, you know, as I was saying, you can build the bridge between whatever a group's concern is. I think that there are very explicit ways that we can help build that bridge between that issue and how it relates to climate, or rather, what is the impact of climate change impacts on that particular issue. You know, we see it with affordable housing and healthcare and, you know, women's health issues, racial justice. It's all very interrelated. So it's getting people to think about that these things are not separate issues, but they can be related, And that is a thing that comes back to, you know, climate literacy and, you know, talking to the community and having specific stakeholder meetings and just being well-versed in how all these things connect. So I think, you know, as the professionals, we have to be the people who advocate and help people build that bridge. And that's just, you know, going by focus area, by, you know, a certain geographic location or whatever, but just being explicit in building that climate literacy, I think really helps make that case and makes it not a separate issue, makes it bipartisan.
And Nicole, I saw your face light up when I asked that question. I know this is central to you. So you want to share a thought?
So yes, and so like some of the things that really start to come to mind is a lot of times when I was hearing about climate change, I would hear about the sea turtles and the polar bears and even the sea level rise. And for me in that moment, it felt so disconnected from my reality and what I needed to be worried about. What I do need to worry about and what a lot of people in my community need to worry about is the fact that rent is becoming prohibitive, right? And we can't afford to live here anymore, that our rent is being raised in the middle of our leases by almost $200, and who can do that in the midst of a pandemic? What does concern me is the fact that that a whole lot of these payday loans are started because people are going to try to figure out how to pay their utility bill that is astronomical, living in a 1-bedroom apartment because of the lack of, it's in the window, and because of the lack, and I'm losing my words right here, but y'all know what I'm talking about. So anyway, so because of that, I could be in a 1-bedroom apartment here in Overtown and paying the same amount of utilities as somebody who has a 5-bedroom house somewhere else. And so those are the things that start to create issues, and those are the things that I really need us to be able to connect the dots on when we talk about heat, and then we start talking about community violence, right? We talk about climate gentrification and all of the impacts of that kind of thing. These things are real, and those are the things that I can recognize as things that need to be addressed for me and my community, right? Like, let's handle that. Let's talk about that so that we can move through that, and talk about asthma, talk about like all of these things that are really impacting us at a high level, and then we can move forward, right? And then you have my attention, because now we can get some things done, right? Help me pay my rent. I mean, not really, but you know. Yes.
So we are in the final stretch of this conversation. This has been so meaningful, so actionable. Would love to just do a quick round of closing thoughts from you all to make sure that you have the chance to drop the mic on the note that you wanted to drop it on. So maybe we'll start where we started with Phoebe. Phoebe, what are your closing thoughts?
Yeah, that was echoing a lot of what Nicole just said, honestly. Like our community is really focused on reimagining public safety. It's the whole initiative to reallocate funding from our local police department to issues like affordable housing or health. And one of the outcomes of that was this concept of neighborhood hubs. And it was interesting because right around this time we had this giant storm and people lost power, and there was a water distribution crisis and food distribution, and it was just a lot of cascading effects. And so from that, the idea that our city had been talking about doing resilience hubs, where it's like backup power, backup water, community hubs where people can walk and charge their phones and access food and all of that. So that idea is happening, and then this like neighborhood hubs idea is part of the Reimagining Public Safety report. And so then the idea was like, oh, these two concepts sound oddly familiar. Like, what can we do to actually take the concepts and the ideas from both and merge them together? So again, taking that that lens and being aware of what's happening in the community and the different concerns. And that's something that, again, is an ongoing basis. I never want to like come up here and act like I'm doing everything right, because I'm still learning about what I need to do and where I need to prioritize my time. But yeah, try to make those connections, be aware of what's going on and listening to the community and trying to make those connections and step away from those silos.
Thanks, Phoebe. Alyssa, final thought.
Yeah, I have two things. Just one, just like piece of practical advice that's kind of come up for me as I've been working is the idea of decoupling outreach and engagement and just seeing them as two separate things that require separate effort. So you can create the world's best program, but if no one comes, what good did you do? So just thinking about, especially there was a, some thought around, consultants and things like that. How do we get them to do good public engagement? Maybe they're not the ones who need to be doing the outreach. They can develop the program, but us, the people who know the community best, who work with, or working with a community partner, can be the people who do the marketing, the outreach, the recruitment for these programs that we create. So I think just making time mentally, emotionally to be doing these things separately and recognizing that they need their own lanes of work, I think will be really helpful in building kind of impactful programs. And then the other thing was just for our community workshops that we did in the summer of 2019, we did these 8 public workshops where they were the hyper local, and I kind of mentioned it before. And that was all made possible through a grant from Partners for Places through the Funders Network. They're really focused on providing funding for equity-focused programming. And they're a great way to kind of like pilot an initiative, make the case for your city. And you can say like, look at all the great outcomes that we had, and therefore, make the case for it to be something that is involved in your annual budget. So if you have a great idea or you just want support on something, for us, we funded these workshops where we provided childcare and translation services and food, and it was after hours. And those were kind of ways that we addressed equity and just kind of like piloted that for the city. And it was super helpful and impactful. So I highly recommend applying for Partners for Places.
Beautiful. Thank you, Alyssa. Nicole, we're inching up on time, but we've got to hear your closing thought.
Okay, first and foremost, I wanted to bring into the space just in terms of resilience of the people. Trust the people to lead and guide and direct, right? Because the reality is we talk about resilience, but the fact that we're still standing and we're still here is a testament to our resilience, especially in this moment. So trust us, right? Bring us in the very beginning. Like Caroline said, nothing for us without us, right? I also have to kind of back up a little bit and just really and truly acknowledge when we talk about the land in which we're standing on, right? And honoring the ultimate sacrifices that have been made over the years, and recognizing the power of cycles. Here in Overtown and Liberty City, which are two of the historically Black communities here in Miami, and there's several others, Coconut Grove. I don't want to leave any out of the mix, so just charge it to my head and rushing. But when we think about what happened to the Iroquois people, to the Tequesta people, and the fact that they were decimated, and down the street in Liberty City, actually the Seminole people were removed, a wall was built, and the Black people were moved in. And we see the same cycle occurring over again, where the Black folks are being moved out, right, to account for this climate gentrification that we're talking about. And so we have to give honor and pay homage. Back in 2019, I heard and I started researching, and I live by the 7 generations theory, and just understanding that everything that we do in this moment to heal, to bring healing, to bring acknowledgement, right, to seek atonement for, not only heals us in this moment, but it heals 7 generations that came before us. And it prepares the way for 7 generations yet to come. And so there's power in this moment. And we have to honor that moment. We have to honor the sacrifices, and we got to love on each other. And that's it.
Thank you. And Ike, bring it home.
Sure. So thank you. One of the things I didn't say is much of the work we do is, referred to as trauma-informed work. We heard about the historical impacts. So we strive through the work we do to ensure we minimize re-triggering that trauma and all of the agencies that we work with. A couple of things I failed to mention is here in Palm Beach County, I'm very proud of the work that's happening. We do have a ways to go, but we've made some significant accomplishments. One of the things that's happening is the Board of County Commissioners, as well as administration, has realized the importance of equity and is in the process of establishing an equity office. So that is so exciting for us. The other thing for me is it's about continuing to educate myself about climate change and how equity relates to it. And I'm so thankful for the opportunity to participate here today. And that was really made possible through our Office of Resiliency, through the leadership of Megan Houston and her team. So I'm so thrilled that they are able to, she reached out to me a while ago and we've had these conversations. She's aware of the Race to Equity summits that we've held over the last few years. She realizes the impacts of it. I've been connected with our Office of Environmental Resource Management, which is obviously involved in this space as well. They started 3 years ago a Green Futures internship that targets our young people and getting them interested in the environment and in resiliency and so forth. So my connection is being able to connect with the community, help them recruit young people to go through those internships. Also with our Parks and Recs department, similar situations. So being able to provide, I call it accessible, equitable opportunities for our young people. And I do a lot of that through what I call the 3 C's, being able to convene folks so they can connect and collaborate.
Beautiful. It has been an honor to share this space with you. I'm going to pass it back over to our hosts. Karina, thank you so much.
Wow, I think that was an incredible, incredible hour. Thank you, Phoebe, Ike, Nicole, Alyssa, Rebecca, for all those amazing thoughts and actionable tips that we can take back to our work immediately. It's really about changing how we do things. I hope that everyone enjoyed the rich discussions and presentations we have heard today, and that you are eager to learn more. Integrating equity into our work is not something that can be done overnight, but we need to consistently ensure we are advancing the work, having the hard conversations, and if you're not having those conversations, ask why they are not happening. We learned that building equity into the work that we do is a journey, and that there's no one silver bullet that will solve it all. We've heard about the importance of history, of listening, of elevating storytelling, of how important mapping solutions is for the community, and also how important it is to create a seat at the table. And that really, when talking to our constituents, it's about connecting climate to the everyday lives of people. And I want to reiterate something that Nicole said. We also need to acknowledge, in acknowledging our history, it's also important to recognize the people that came before us, including the indigenous people that occupied where we are in Southeast Florida. And I apologize that we did not mention that before. And so, again, thank you to our speakers. Thank you to all of you who have been listening all this time. Thank you to the planning committee. And also thank you to the Institute for Sustainable Communities, who has consistently provided implementation support of the compact, specifically Lauren, Russell, and Dan. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Following today's workshop, you're going to be receiving a survey, and we hope that you'll fill it out. And you'll also get an email with the link to this recording. So please feel free to share it. We'll also share out some of the resources that were talked about in today's session. And we hope that you learned a lot, that it's going to change how you do, and that you're going to think about how your work connects to equity. We look forward to your participation in future compact implementation workshops and the in-person virtual 13th Annual Climate Leadership Summit at the Palm Beach Convention Center in December. Thank you and have a wonderful evening.